Not at all the worldly, savvy creature that he had been unconsciously expecting. "There you have it, people, a woman of few words." Heather spoke into her wireless microphone. "Let's show her how much we appreciate her for coming here this bright and sunny morning." More applause, and much of it warm-hearted. Rick had to give Holberg credit for ad-libbing, as it was a perfect way of getting the crowd firmly on her side. This was obviously an awkward moment for the towering golden woman, and it took someone of strong character and charm to play intermediary for the shy giantess so she would seem more human and appealing. As it was, a warm and caring human being was showing forth from behind the identity of the superhero, and that was exactly the right tone to strike in order to bring across the implicit message that, alien or not, this visitor from a foreign world was friendly and in no way hostile. Again the microphone was presented to her, and with a bit more confidence than before the golden beauty said, "Thank you. You honor me more than you could ever know. I am Marsa of Ninjarma, dubbed the Ultra Girl in your press. I am here as a friend. I came to your world a few months ago seeking refuge among you, and it seems that, by a strange quirk of fate, I have been gifted with unusual abilities by contact with your world's sun. You see, my world's sun is a red dwarf star, about 1,000 times less bright than your own soul, and my people have been genetically adapted to absorb the life-giving energy of what we call biosolid radiance, and that is what has gifted me with these abilities that have made me superhuman." As she was saying this, Rick suddenly became aware of two people pressing through the edge of the crowd, bypassing the ring of burly security guards with a wave of a badge, which immediately set off Rick's well-honed instincts, as he knew what cops were like and how some bulls of the breed tended to throw their weight around from an exaggerated sense of duty. This pair startled him for the sheer incongruity they presented. One was a middle-aged man with a bristly iron-gray mustache and a receding hairline, overweight by a good 50 pounds and not particularly imposing, yet having that determined glare in his eyes that as much as said that he set his own rules more often than followed department policy. His partner was the one who stood out even more than the old guy, her being a babe and a looker with dark hair flowing freely about her shoulders. She wore jeans and a corduroy vest and had a feather dangling from one side of her hair, giving her an oddly Western look that was matched by her well-tanned complexion. She wore boots just as much as the older man wore loafers, and just by looking at the two of them you could tell that they were here on a matter of business. Wolfram is in a star system approximately 597 light-years from your own system, Marsa was just then explaining. It has about twice the mass of Earth and roughly double your gravity, and it once supported a thriving biosphere up until around 400 solar cycles ago, when the environment of our world collapsed and forced our ancestors to create environmental domes in order to preserve our population. The events that caused this collapse are similar to what you call the greenhouse effect. Rick saw the pair reach the edge of the stage, and it seemed likely that they were about to make their presence known directly. In fact, the older cop held his badge at the ready and seemed about to raise his voice to bring a halt to these proceedings, but before he got the chance someone else beat him to the punch, and in an astonishingly graphic manner. All at once a man further back in the crowd lifted a bullhorn and cried out, "GAT behind me, Satan!" Marsa blinked and halted in the delivery of her speech, turning and looked at the man heckling her, even as other heads swerved around and stared his way in annoyance. "Base harlot," the man declared, "foul temptress raised by the fallen one to mock the Lord, thy God. Do not be deceived by her lies, my children, for she is the enemy of Christ, our Lord. This whore of Babylon is Satan's own mistress. Do not permit her to mislead you into blasphemy and fornication." I beg your pardon?" Marsa asked. "Security," Heather called out, waving at the heckler with the bullhorn. Rick noted the burly men in security uniforms were already converging on the silver-haired gentleman so obnoxiously wielding the bullhorn, but before they could accost the troublemaker, a number of people surrounding the heckler suddenly linked arms and formed a protective ring around him, stopping the guards in their tracks with their defiance. The man himself had hardly dropped a beat as he continued his harangue, "Foul Ashtoreth, base temptress, thy charms may mock and deceive these innocents, but this servant of the Lord is not blinded by thy wicked false charms and secular humanism." What are you talking about?" Marsa asked, clearly bewildered by the man's accusing tone and general spiel of disconnected invectives. "Ashtoreth, the mysterious redhead named Astarte murmured in a sulky tone, "I like that." "Is he for real?" Phoebe asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Unfortunately," Katie snorted, A Bible-bashing fundy. That's just terrific. Your lies betray you, harlot. The man loudly declared, you claim to be from another world, but it is written that his apostles preached to all the nations of the earth, and there can be no life but that which was born upon this world where Christ sacrificed himself upon the cross so that his children would be saved by his message. I have no idea what you are talking about, Marsaw said before surrendering the microphone to Heather Holberg. Kathy, she hissed sidelong to her assistant, get that clown out of here now before he starts a riot. Already on it, Kathy spoke into her own mic and said, I don't care if you have to use tear gas, get that creep and his buddies off the lawn and into the booby hatch or you're out of a job, boys. Rick privately doubted that restraining methods would be at all effective with this lot because his sense of the matter told him that the loud-mouthed haranguer was only just getting wound up for a spiel that could go on for hours. He had known Bible thumpers who took pride in their ability to thunder out line and verse until they had either beaten you into submission or had driven you into a coma, the latter being a kind of mercy as you would no longer be able to hear their ranting, and this guy clearly was no exception. I have come to drive thee back to hell lest thee turn the minds of the young, gullible and impressionable youth who might follow thee down the fetid path of eternal damnation. Why are you saying these awful things about me? Marsaw asked. What have I ever done to you to deserve this? You've done nothing, Marsaw, Heather said crossly. This fool is a religious fanatic named Reverend Schiller. I've dealt with him before, he's a certifiable nutcase. That's giving him way too much credit, Kathy snorted. Religion? Marsaw blinked. What he is saying is a part of someone's religion. The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want, so saith the Lord. The white-haired man with the bullhorn declared loudly, in Christ there is salvation, but in Satan there is only death and damnation eternal. The servant of the Antichrist shall never prevail against the righteous. That's not religion. Katie cried as she leaped to her feet, he's a fraud pretending to be a holy man, and this cheap stunt is just for publicity for his idiot cause. Yeah. Phoebe declared hotly, how dare you disrupt Marsaw's debut, you creep. Try coming over here and saying that and I'll kick your butt from here to New Jersey. Marsaw was bewildered by the whole affair as she looked from her friends to the white-haired man heckling her with his bullhorn. The words he hurled at her made little or no sense and sounded like a mishmash of erroneous accusations laced with primitive, superstitious mumbo-jumbo bearing only a superficial resemblance to anything religious. She could not understand why he was targeting her with such contempt and disdain, and she could not get a lock on his thoughts as they seemed to be awash in a jumble of confused imagery, much of it quite frightening and repulsive. But the man hardly seemed the least bit fazed when police officers converged on the scene to try and pull his followers away in order to get at him. The people forming the protective circle had locked arms together and were forcefully resisting any and all persuasions, singing instead a chant that sounded like, "We are one in the arms of the Lord, Jesus is our shepherd," and similar such nonsense. And still the so-called Reverend Schiller continued to harangue her with such hateful words as, "Repent, ye sinners. Let the bosom of Christ wash away your sins, let not the legions of Caesar defile you with their pagan force of arms, for we do not fear the beast and his allies as they seek to number the United States. The Lord protects the United States with his righteous anger, and woe be to he who dares raise a hand against the Lord's servants." Rick was about ready to raise more than a hand at this asshole, but he was a little more concerned about the way the mob was milling around in response to these theatrics. Many seemed ready to pelt the Reverend and his flock with stones while others were nodding their heads with agreement. More than a few were just pleasantly confused about the whole affair as if uncertain which side to take, or just looking to see if there were any entertainment value to be obtained by standing around waiting for the next shoe to drop. Rick knew from experience that such mobs were dangerous when restless, and it would take very little to set them off into a riot, a fact that made him feel the strong urge to go looking for the exits before the ignition point was reached in this budding crisis. Hiram Turla was just as much alarmed at the very same thing, and though he had come to the park for very different reasons than to give praise to the golden-skinned woman, the cop within him had his hackles out with all the mental alarm bells ringing. The formula for a major riot had all the key ingredients in place, and all that was needed now was for some hothead to throw a match into the inferno. "I don't like this," Sarah murmured at his side, glancing around in nervous apprehension. "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord, thy God." "Would you shut up already?" Kathy snapped. "Security." "No, wait. Heather declared, speaking into her mic and signaling for the sound men to raise the volume a bit so that she could drown out the rabble, pitching her voice just right as she declared, "Be silent, old man. No one wants to hear you lie about my good friend while pretending to be a man of God, you impostor." That brought a moment of silence to the man with the bullhorn, but then he rallied himself and started to say, "Shameless slut. How dare you? How dare you, sir, pretend to come here in the name of the God to whom you blaspheme?" Heather's voice lacked the stridency of Schiller, but there was no mistaking the power that she could protect through her controlled and even temper. "You are nothing but a false prophet here to promote yourself by hurling unjust accusations at a person who has done nothing to deserve your contempt." "She has done everything to deserve it," Schiller insisted, "and who are you to accuse me of self-promotion? You who publish that icon to fornication that you call a magazine, pornographer, slut, harlot." "Guilty as charged," Heather replied, "and may I return the compliment? You claim to be a man of God, but the only gods you worship are hate and greed, sir. You are a money-shanger pretending to be a high priest, a man who takes money from widows and orphans claiming that it is for charity while you spend lavishly on yourself to support an opulent lifestyle worthy of a prince of Egypt. And how many wives have you had, by the way? I believe that you are on your third, or has your church reversed its position on divorce and remarriage?" "Foul Jezebel!" Schiller cried in righteous outrage, "here in the city of New Sodom you dare promote your foul pretense that the succubus from hell and false miracle worker is the representative of alien life from beyond this world? We all know that such things are a blasphemy against the name of the Lord." "I know of no such blasphemy," Heather denied. "The one who blasphemes here is you, Schiller. I only vouch for the claims of my good friend, who came here as a favor to me and the good people of San Francisco thinking that she would be received by civilized human beings and not pretenders to a false claim on religion." "Be silent, woman." Schiller's tone became even more righteous. "Beu scoin of Eve or Lilith, no woman can dare mock the name of the Lord. Are you claiming to be God now?" Heather wondered, "Have you that much conceit and arrogance that you presume to speak to me about God? Where is the humility of the shepherd, the humble man of faith who turns the other cheek and refuses to return evil for evil?" "Wait." Marsaw moved closer to Heather. "I'm afraid I don't understand any of this. Just why exactly is it you are saying these hurtful things about me? What have I ever done that was so evil? You mislead and deceive these people by pretending to be that which is against the word of God, Tentris." Schiller declared heartily, "Did God grant you the ability to fly? Has He given you the miraculous gift of healing the sick and the afflicted? Has He raised a woman to have the might of Samson and the swiftness of a dove, or did you gain your powers from Satan so that he could sow confusion among the people and lead them away from the true faith to a belief in aliens and UFOs? And do you claim that I cannot be from another world?" Marsaw asked. "I'm not making up any story, I am from another world. And as for my abilities, I cannot account for them myself sometimes, but do you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and His miracles?" Schiller thundered. I don't know anything about that sort of thing," Marsaw replied. "On my world they don't even talk about religion." "You see?" Schiller declared triumphantly. "She admits that she is a godless atheist come among the United States to spread her lies in the name of the Antichrist." "What?" Marsaw blinked. "But I said no such thing." "Excuse me." A voice suddenly spoke up from very close to Reverend Schiller. "Reverend? Can I have a moment of your time here?" Even Schiller seemed taken aback at finding Rick Shepard standing right beside him, having managed to crawl between the legs of the followers when they were too busy resisting the passive restraint tactics of the police and security guards, and now he had his trusty notepad and pen in hand and was much too close to Schiller for the Reverend to easily ignore him. "Eh?" the Reverend asked, momentarily off balance. "Rick Shepard of the San Francisco Times-Chronicle," Rick said by way of introduction. "Reverend, is it true that you're being audited by the IRS for possible tax evasion charges and the illegal use of church funds to finance candidates for the City Council and Board of Education?" "What?" Schiller stammered. "But what about reports that you've been encouraging your followers to commit random acts of violence against public schools, libraries, bookstores and abortion clinics? Is it true that you're either directly or indirectly responsible for property damage totaling in the hundreds of thousands of dollars?" I have no knowledge about such things," Schiller stammered. Are you sure? Rick asked, holding up his portable tape recorder. In that case, perhaps you'd like to issue a statement on why the Council of Churches is considering revoking your membership over a recent televised broadcast of your Club 600 show. And did you really call the new Pope an Oxford moron? Lies, blasphemy. Schiller angrily declared, you godless liberals of the press distort everything, slanting the news to confuse the faithful. Maybe so, yet another voice said stiffly as Turlo held up his badge and waved it under the noses of the nearest members of the human shield surrounding Schiller for added effect, but you're inciting a riot with your presence, Reverend, so if you don't pull back now you and these sheep of yours are gonna be seriously arrested. You can't intimidate me. Schiller cried, I answer only to a higher power. Yeah, and I answer to the mayor, who's sitting right over there if you want to dispute me on this, and the governor's with him. Turlo snorted, clear out now or we'll drag you out of here in cuffs. This freak show act of yours ends now or you'll all be looking at jail time. I shall not relinquish the field while that whore of Babylon is. Schiller started to proclaim, but Sarah saw an opening and promptly threw her own pitch into the fray. Careful, she said with a dangerous smile on her lips, you don't want to say anything that could get you hauled into court on a libel suit. They could take you to the cleaners right now for all of the name-calling you've been hurling about, preacher man. Hey, Turlo said gruffly, you'd better listen. You don't want to tick off my partner or she could pull out her tomahawk and scalp you. He winked at the nearest of the human shields, who blinked in response and started to look nervous. Sarah decided to add a little something to the effect by growling softly while fingering the handle to the Bowie knife that she routinely carried against department policy, but her superiors had long since given up making an issue on that subject. The combined effect had its desired result as Schiller glared at the both of them, then at Shepard, and lastly up at Marsaw before uttering a contemptful snort and turning about saying, we are leaving, but this is a long way from over, fornicators. Don't go away mad, Reverend, Rick smiled, just go away. And do so in an orderly manner, Heather declared with a sweet but firm smile of grim satisfaction. She waited until Schiller and his group were fully gone before saying, good riddance to that lot. I am very terribly sorry for the interruption, people. That should never have been allowed to happen. You're telling me? Kathy Stage whispered with a sour look of her own, how did those bozos sneak up so close in the crowd? Somebody's gonna have some questions to answer at our next security briefing. I'm not blaming you for that, darling, Heather replied as she turned around and said, Mr. Mayor, Governor, I am so terribly sorry about all this. No need, the mayor said. We've all been there and done that, the governor agreed with completely honest candor. Still and all, Astarte mused, you people did an excellent job of diffusing the crisis. A pity that it came a bit too late for our guest of honor. Huh? Katie said, turning around and saying, hey, where's Marcia? Up there. Phoebe pointed, and they turned in time to see the golden-skinned alien girl drifting off into the sky and gaining altitude by the second. Marcia. She's running away? Kathy asked. No way. She can't do that. She just did. Heather sighed with a look of resignation. I fear that the party is over before it even begins, and I, for one, cannot blame her for being this upset. I can. Katie fumed. I thought I taught her better than this. Running away won't solve anything here, it just gives the creep a victory. Maybe so, Astarte rumbled in reply, but in the face of great evil it is sometimes best to retreat to regather your resources. Your friend has much thinking to do it would seem, and as someone who has been there and done that I can only pray that she finds herself, and quickly. Rick also watched his golden goddess drifting off to become a mere speck in the distance before murmuring under his own breath, Dear Lord above, forgive us because we knew not what we were doing. For comments and criticisms contact me at shadowmain@ridgenet.net. Marsaw the Ultra Girl by Jim Robert Bader Book 1 Part 2 The Girl of Tungsten Steel Chapter 25 Theology Lessons In one of the saddest developments of modern recorded history, a stranger from another world came to us in the spirit of friendship, displaying only the good faith of her intentions, and we, barbarians that we are, drove her away because the message that she came to deliver to us does not meet up with our primitive view of ourselves as the center of all creation. Rick wanted to hit the delete key, to erase the words as he might tear up a sheet of paper, but he was overdue to meet his deadline and he could not afford to start his article all over from the beginning. Instead he leaned back in his chair and stared up at the ceiling while trying to calm down from his anger so that he could compose his thoughts in some kind of coherent order. He ran his hands over his face and counted to 10 backwards, but nothing useful came of this as he just kept reliving the moment over and over again in his mind, wanting to delete the whole event and pretend that it had never happened. "Deadline nerves, Rick?" asked Steve Kendall, the sports writer, who had come over to offer a cup of coffee in a comradely manner. "Harry'll have a fit if you don't have that done by at least sunset." "I know," Rick sighed as he accepted the peace offering and sniffed at the coffee brew before wincing slightly, then taking a sip anyway as the idea of torturing himself actually seemed rather appealing. "It's just sometimes I think this country is going the way of the Taliban, know what I mean?" "I hear that," Steve nodded enthusiastically. "So is it true the rumor that's been going around? Did you really beard the chiller guy in the park today? Wish I could have seen that." "I wish it had been you instead of me," Rick replied. "The guy's a walking nightmare, Adolf Hitler with a Bible. The stuff I've heard about him. It's a wonder he's even walking the streets a free man today. I'm just glad he's allergic to giving interviews, or that thing in the park could have turned into a full riot." "Would have made good news if it had," Steve noted, waving his own coffee mug to illustrate the point. "Promising junior investigative reporter trampled to death by mob at outdoor revivalism concert. You gotta admit, it would have got you the page 1, column 1 headline." "Yeah," Rick snorted, "that kind of free publicity I don't need. Maybe Harry's right about me being a little too close to this story." "Bullshit," Steve said, "you've got the inside lead on a story of the century." "Hell with that, the millennium. Golden girl steals car from reporter, love at first theft. Gotta admit, it's got real human interest value." "Glad you find it so amusing," Rick replied. "Me, I just chalk it up as another dead end in a case that's been full of wrong turns and frustrations." "So," Steve mused, "what's the secret? How did you know what to say to send the good Reverend running?" "Oh, it was nothing much," Rick replied. "I did research on him a few months back when I was looking into the paramilitary phenomena. Did you know that the guy has his own private army of wackos? They train out in the foothills of Oregon and Montana using live ammunition and preaching a diatribe of real hate against the Jews, Catholics, liberals and media types, meaning us. They talk about the apocalypse as if it were a real and coming event, and they swear when it happens that they're gonna turn loose their flock of faithful gun-toting nuts to take out all the enemies of the Lord that they can find, starting with abortion doctors, educators, lawyers and Freemasons. All that in one swoop?" Steve said, "And won't the feds do anything about it?" "They don't expect the government to be a problem," Rick explained. "When the rapture of the saved hits, they expect millions of people to just up and disappear from their jobs, which will leave those behind shaking their heads in bewilderment and confusion. Society as we know it will disintegrate and anarchy will take the place of the federal government, which is where they get to go on a shooting rampage so they can impose God's kingdom on the surviving faithful. How many faithful could there be if the lucky ones get grabbed up into heaven?" Steve wondered. "Hey, I didn't say it was a logical philosophy, or that it even makes sense to an outsider like me," Rick replied, "but it makes Schiller a very dangerous man with soldiers who'd be willing to go out and die for a cause just like any Arab terrorist group, and just as fanatical in their beliefs. Of course Schiller himself doesn't exactly live a life of austerity and denial, and it left a paper trail a mile wide that's currently under investigation." "So this whole publicity stunt of his," Steve began, "was nothing more than an attempt to draw fresh funds to his cause to pay off his legal expenses," Rick replied. "Of course the way he thinks, and I use the term loosely, he probably does see Marsaw as a legitimate threat to his franchise since her very existence contradicts a good deal of his dogma." "Man, I hate mixing it up with these holy roller types," Steve winced. "You give them an inch and they walk all over you, you stand up to them and you get accused of being anti-religion. No way to win an argument with those guys, and all you do is wind up getting yourself in a lawsuit." "Tell me about it," Rick sighed as he closed down the file and reached for his coat. "I gotta get out of here, blow off some steam for a bit. Cover for me, and if Harry asks where I am you're out doing research for your big story." "Got it," Steve replied, watching his coworker take his leave of the bullpen before adding, "Glad I don't have his job. All I gotta put up with is overpaid athletes who get a little too ass-slappy. That and 7-foot goddesses with a football fetish." he sniffed, glancing over at his desk and thinking about the latest Wire story on that topic. "I'm really sorry about that, Heather," Fiona apologized. "It was my team that dropped the ball here. We should have known that Chiller or one of the other fundies would try something like this, but we didn't screen the audience enough to pick them up in this crowd." Heather stared out the window of her San Francisco office and sighed a bit before saying, "It's all right, I don't blame you for this. It's just, we all went to a lot of trouble to set this up and we should have seen that something like this was bound to happen." "How could you?" Katie snorted. "I didn't see it coming either, and I'm trained to expect the unexpected." "Yeah," Kathy replied, "but you didn't just blow over $2 million, plus licensing fees and televised advertising. The show we were about to put on was supposed to run for a full hour." "It's not the money that worries me," Heather sighed. "Our insurance carriers will provide an adequate compensation for our losses. It's the shame of losing out to that pig and his sheep. I feel as though I have been violated, as if a primitive tribe of savage witch-finders broke up a peace rally demanding blood sacrifices for atonement." "Oh," Kathy winced, "I hate it when you get biblical on me, boss. Granted, a horde of screaming mongrels would have behaved better than that lot, but the real impact here is what effect this is gonna have upon poor Marcia." "Yes," mused the woman known as Astardi from where she sat next to her bodyguard companion, a hulking brute of a man whose handsome features and robust frame made him seem almost like a Greek god dressed up in a chauffeur's uniform, and packing enough hardware to start some serious trouble. That is the effect that should most concern us, seeing as she is quite clearly inexperienced in dealing with fanaticism and extremism of the religious sort, even given the facts about her background. This blow to both her reputation and her ego must seem quite devastating considering the benevolence that she has so far demonstrated before the public." "Indeed," Heather sighed, "I have often wondered how I might explain to a visitor from another world the mindset of people to whom the Middle Ages would be viewed as the good old days, as though it were a distinguishing mark of our civilization to beat your chest with sackcloth and ashes." "Don't be so hard on yourself, Heather-san," Katie urged. "You can blame yourself for not seeing the Chiller creep coming after Marcia." "I blame myself for not preparing her," Heather replied. "I am used to dealing with self-righteous charlatans like Chiller, and I also should have anticipated how the conservative community itself would react in denial when presented the clear evidence of her existence. After all, such men view the world through the prism of their own provincial beliefs, and to shock them with the reality of life on other worlds, life where the name Jesus has never been spoken, must appear to them as most traumatic concept demanding immediate refutation. Considering how worked up they still get over the teaching of the theory of evolution." "Yeah," Kathy says, "life on other worlds might appeal to us science geeks and sci-fi buffs, but to guys still living in the Stone Age hearing about people on the other side of the hill must be a real threat to their whole worldview. Small wonder we never got that far with space travel, having jerks like that thump their collective chests over nothing." "Nothing to you, perhaps," Astardi replied, "but to them it means everything, and when you have a very narrow worldview that does not permit the existence of a differing opinion, let alone one that stands opposed to their entire philosophy on life, it becomes a desperate struggle to maintain your beliefs against the pull of reason that draws one in the opposite direction." "Sounds to me like you've got your own take about this," Katie noted with a hint of suspicion. "I have had more than my share of run-ins with the likes of Schiller and his ilk," Astardi replied. "It comes with the territory when you have a rather unique condition such as mine. At any rate, it is not just the effect of this primitive tribalism upon Marcia that should be considered, one must also take into account the other casualty who shares her mindset." The woman with the dark sunglasses nodded towards Phoebe, who was also sitting by the window staring out into the distance, her manner listless and her posture lacking the normal energy so typical of the cocky free spirit that she normally came across as. The blonde girl's mind was clearly far away from their conversation, and it was doubtful if she had even heard a word being spoken in her presence. "Poor Phoebe," Kathy says, "what it must be like for her, seeing the woman she loves being tormented by a flame-throwing fanatic." "Indeed," Heather murmured softly, "but added to that are the deep emotional and psychic bond shared by the two of them, which makes the pain of one deeply felt by the other." "Yes," Astardi mused, glancing up at her bodyguard and saying, "Felipe here could tell you a thing or two on that subject, and we all have had occasions when the suffering of a loved one has bitten us deeply. I can well sympathize with the plight of Ms. Winters. However, Sitting around and moping about it is neither my style, nor does it serve any useful, viable function. So, what do you propose?" Katie asked. "Indulge me a bit, Ms. Cross." Astardi inclined her head politely. "I do believe that I may offer your students some valuable insight into what it means to be treated as an outsider. You see, I, too, have been shunned as a pariah due to the nature of my heritage and appearance, and I know exactly what the prejudice she faces feels like. Indeed, feeling is often all that I have, my most trusted of companions, and alienation can be a source of comfort as well as grief, knowing that I bear a unique legacy that entitles me to a certain degree of status here. Therefore I will seek to commune with your Marsaw in the hopes that my situation could offer to her a fresh perspective." "Oh yeah?" Katie sat forward and scowled. "And what exactly is it that makes you so special, Jones?" "Mon chéri," the hulking Philippe began to say as if in mourning. "It is all right, Philippe," Astardi assured her bodyguard. "Ms. Cross is entitled to know, nor would I wish to keep from her such a vital bit of knowledge that would help her to see from what angle I am coming here." And with that the strange red-headed woman removed both her hat and her glasses and smiled as she turned to face Katie. There was a small gasp from around the room, for the pale white eyes that gazed back upon them had no pupil and no iris, just milky whites framed by an unusually heavy set of lashes with her brow ridges forming into a pair of arching antennae, the effect giving the woman's face a decidedly unearthly appearance. "You see?" Astardi acknowledged their startled expressions. "Your friend, Marsaw, is far from the only alien currently residing upon this planet. In point of fact, I am but half human on my mother's side, but the other half is something altogether otherworldly." It was a fairly common cliché in his profession, returning to the scene of the crime, yet Rick had found time and again that it worked when trying to organize one's thoughts and gain a fresh perspective. By reviewing old data he could sometimes perceive something that he had missed the first time around, and when giving himself more time to think he could often arrive at the most surprising epiphanies, allowing him to view a story from the advantage of time and distance. He glanced around at the now deserted Hyde Park and took notice of the strewn trash and trampled grass that surrounded the partially dismantled sound stage, and as he stared upon this he replayed the events all over in his mind, trying to decide if there were something he might have done that could have changed the eventual outcome, as though discovering such a clever tack might have helped him to reverse the calamitous present. "Wishful thinking," he snorted, feeling the disgust and outrage curdling up from within him at the mess created by Schiller and his hangers-on. The event had not just ended badly, it had turned into a total disaster and most likely had tarnished the reputation of his golden goddess forever. People would think back on this event for decades and only remember that the ultra girl had been driven off scared by a rabble-rousing bigot and his bullhorn, which was some way to behave when you were a superhero. He heaved a sigh and started to wonder if there really was any hope for humanity. He had never felt ashamed of being immortal before, but when he thought about that loud-mouthed crusader he had a violent urge to do something really nasty. Trust a clown like that to bring out the worst that was in humanity, and while Rick had affirmed his own faith that such evil men could be driven away by the light of truth as uncovered by an investigative journalist, the victory still went to Schiller for achieving his objective and driving a goddess into self-imposed exile. Which, in effect, meant driving away the message she brought, and the truth that she symbolized and embodied. Once more the Luddites had torn down the monuments to civilization, the barbarians had destroyed the symbols of enlightenment that they hated with such passion, and the savage had won out over reason. Never mind that Marsaw represented an unknown branch of humanity from whom mere Terrans might learn a great deal to their advantage, one could not risk contaminating the soul with tawdry thoughts about life on other worlds, let alone a mere girl who could do things in a way that redefined godhood. It made sense in a way that Schiller would fear and resent such a person, but to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had defeated a goddess. "And what would you have done different?" a voice asked, startling Rick out of his aimless meditations. Rick turned around and saw a stranger sitting on a nearby park bench, a blonde of some sort, not too attractive but hardly unattractive either, and his automatic response was, "Excuse me?" The blonde looked up at him as if startled. "Oh? Ah. Never mind. Just thinking aloud. Sorry." Rick frowned as he stared at the stranger, sensing that there was something not quite right in her appearance, but he could not quite put his finger on the matter, so instead he looked away and said, "That's funny, because for a second there it was like you were reading my mind or something." Excuse me?" she asked with a hesitant expression. "Oh, never mind," Rick sighed. "I just meant that I was thinking to myself about what a stupid waste it was to let a creep like Schiller get away with what he did." "Oh. Yes. I saw you earlier," the blonde replied. "You spoke out against him. I think he was even a little bit afraid of you. How did you do that?" "Hey, nothing makes scum like that run like the truth," Rick replied. "Besides, I'm a reporter, and I'm used to having people take a hike when I'm in their presence." "Oh, yes," the blonde said without much reaction. "I suppose that does make sense, though I think the man was simply confused, either that or insane." "You heard the things he said to her up on that stage?" Rick turned to give the blonde a quiet stare before nodding. "Yeah, I heard it all, like I've heard 100,000 other guys just like him preach their perverted faith to the ignorant masses." "What about it?" "It's just—" The blonde hesitated before saying, "Why do people such as him walk around looking to cause such hurt in other people? What could she have done to him that would make him act like that?" "Who knows?" Rick shrugged. "His mama probably dropped him on the head when he was little." "Oh?" the blonde remarked as if thinking that remark over. "Oh. I see. Yes, that could potentially do it." Something in that statement caused Rick to stare more critically at the stranger, realizing that the thing that seemed so irregular about her was that her appearance had edges, as though he was not quite seeing the real her through a curious haze that was affecting his vision. Sensing that to ask too close on this matter might be to spoil the moment, and potentially drive away a genuine information source, he said in a casual way, "If you wanna know what makes guys like Schiller tick, you've gotta do something really, really scary, which is to go into their twisted little heads and study the warped gray matter that passes for their brains. And even then you won't get to the real heart of it, but from where I stand, they create themselves, or life creates them, or they find something that they mislabel as religion and it gives their life a badly needed focus." "Well, sort of." "A focus," the blonde seemed to consider the word, then she looked up at Rick again and asked, "Tell me, what thought runs through your mind when you think of the word religion?" The question faintly surprised Rick as it sounded both sincere and naively worded, but he decided to treat her petition seriously enough so he looked away and said, "For me? A church, a bunch of people all gathered around praying, some guy in a chaplain's gown giving a speech about God and the Bible. Which is pretty much what most people think about when you say the word religion. Some of it's spiritually uplifting, like belief that there's some guy somewhere who honestly gives a damn about us and who'll forgive us no matter what our transgressions." "And yet you don't feel like that," the woman said softly, "do you?" Rick wondered if the woman could read his mind or something, or maybe he was just a little too transparent in his cynicism. "Lady, I've seen a lot of stuff in my time. I've been to parts of the world where the Crusades are still a going concern, and in the Balkans I've seen a priest get murdered in his own cathedral, along with part of his congregation, just because somebody else thinks he belongs to the wrong type of religion. I've seen guys quoting both the Quran and the Bible to justify atrocities that you'd think no sane people would ever think of committing, and two groups allegedly worshipping the same God go at it like bad relations. And you know what? God didn't do anything to stop them. No major miracles, no parting of the waters, no voice from above telling them to knock it off and stop acting like spoiled children. Not even a fiery play nice burnt into clay tablets so they get the message loud and clear. Of course they're not really fighting about religion over there, it's just an excuse to rationalize killing people so you can take their property and land for yourself." "How awful," the woman said. "Why do they fight like that if they believe in a common set of values?" "Well, that's just it," Rick replied. "They don't really share the same values, and deep down where it counts neither side is willing to admit to the humanity of the other. They'd rather see their differences as a reason to divide themselves rather than unite over a common religion. Much of the struggle is ethnic and historical, but that's also just another cheap rationalization for doing bad things to perfectly ordinary people." "I don't understand this at all," the blonde admitted. "I thought religion was supposed to offer hope to people." "For most people it does," Rick replied, "but try telling that to a 9-year-old kid who gets shot dead by a sniper. I've looked into the eyes of the dead and you can see that a vital spark is missing from them, like you only see the husk after death, not the soul of the person that they were when they were still very much alive. I've searched for years to find some answers about why a just and merciful God would allow things like that to happen, And after a while I got tired to hearing the same old tired excuses recited over and over. About God's will being beyond our understanding, of our having free will and being free to make bad choices. The dead don't get to make any choices, they're just dead, and the living are often just acting out a script written for them by madmen who don't know any better. They don't get any choices either, it's all been decided for them in advance and they're just going through the motions like good little robots. You sound so bitter, the blonde softly noted. Is there nothing positive to you about religion? Oh, sure, Rick replied, I'm just giving the bad examples. I've also met Buddhists, Jews, Catholics and Muslims who are all good and decent people, and I've been welcomed with friendly arms into mosques, synagogues and temples, so I know firsthand what religion means to a majority of the faithful. Then why are you so troubled by it all? The blonde asked. I guess because I'm basically a doubting Thomas at heart, Rick replied. I want to see where the nail wounds got hammered. I want to know why people fill their minds with hate while claiming to represent a God of peace and infinite justice. I'm way beyond the Sunday school religion that they taught back when I was little, moving from base to base like I did with my father. I know pretty much what it means to have your faith be tested and to wrestle with my conscience and all that, but, well, basically I can't believe in the same things I used to anymore. I could quite swallow the idea of a God who's simultaneously all good, all-powerful and all-wise. And why not? Marsaw asked. Well, think about it, Rick urged. If a God were all-powerful and all-wise, it would mean that he knew everything at every moment of the day throughout the entire cosmos 24/7. He'd know if someone were doing something bad and be able to do something about it, but if he holds back from taking action, that's the same thing as allowing bad things to happen. How then can he be all good? I've heard plenty of guys answer that one with the standard pat explanation, it's God's will, but I can't believe that after seeing the kind of suffering that I have. No God who's basically benevolent could want or permit stuff like that to happen. The concept does not make sense to me either, the blonde replied, especially the omniscient part. To be truly all-knowing would take a mind capable of multitasking on a level that would exceed the finest computer ever imagined by a factor of 10 to the 90th power. It's a given fact that no computer can be completely self-aware about every aspect of its own design and function. Too much core processing time would be consumed just analyzing the reams of essentially useless data. You're a computer expert? Rick asked. Ah. The blonde seemed momentarily off balance. Somewhat. Actually, I am an engineer by trade. Oh, Rick smiled, you sound a little like an engineer. Of course most engineers I've known have a pretty mechanistic view of the universe. It comes from having the same mindset, I suppose, the blonde admitted. So, you no longer accept the idea of a God of universal truth and justice? Not the way he was described to me when I was a kid, Rick replied. I mean, I've looked into the eyes of sincere believers and heard they tell me how God could reach out his hand and stop the world in its orbit for an entire day just so a man and his followers could win a major battle. I mean, can you imagine what that would be like to stop an entire planet in its orbit and halt the inertia of every rock, tree and pebble so they don't all go flying off into space? And then to set everything back in motion again so that astronomers could still chart the course of the stars and planets to the nth degree? And what about all the other astronomers in the world who never reported seeing anything like that happen, the world standing still and all that? After a while you figure out it's just a story, a stupid exaggeration that was probably told by some camel-haired around a campfire to impress his buddies. It got written down as truth and accepted as canon a long time after anyone would be alive to contradict the argument, so today you get people who really do believe that the God whom they worship is that powerful, and logical explanations to the contrary be damned. I cannot say that I understand this myself, the blonde remarked, but I was given to understand that the purpose of religion was to be spiritually uplifting. The only uplifting about a guy like Schiller is what he does to your wallet, Rick countered. When I was researching about him and his cult I came across a lot of disturbing facts that didn't exactly jibe with his claims to being a man of the cloth. Priests are supposed to put the spiritual welfare of their followers above their own personal egos, but this guy takes self-aggrandizement to a whole new level, and he's not alone in that regard. Lots of preachers on Pray TV are like that, especially that God Send guy, the one Schiller's promoted like a son and heir for his televangelist program, the 600 Club. God Send? the blonde repeated with an uplifted eyebrow. "His real name's Jeffrey Taylor, and he's a piece of work, let me tell you." Rick shook his head in dismay. He typifies a phenomenon called rapture syndrome. It's the ability to mesmerize an audience with fiery speeches about hellfire and brimstone, stuff too graphic for normal Sunday school sermons. He gets down to the visceral emotions of an audience and starts playing around with their prejudices and latent preconceptions, works his way under the radar of normal skepticism and starts playing around with your head until you can no longer tell what's right or wrong anymore, and then he convinces you that his way is right and that you are a miserable sinner for never having seen this before. A victim is then made to feel guilty and remorseful about every little bad thing that they may or may not have done in their lives, and that leaves them open and vulnerable to the rapture of conversion. "It sounds rather like a form of mind control," the blonde remarked with a faintly appalled expression. "Oh, it is," Rick nodded his head sadly. "I've seen a lot of really decent and basically honorable people get hooked in on that line, and before too long they act like mindless robots parroting the line of bull that Taylor feeds them. Before too long he can convince them of anything, and I swear the guy seems to actually feed on their worshipful adulation. He's like a vampire wearing the cloth or something, and it doesn't matter how many times he says the name Jesus, I swear that guy is downright evil." "How do you mean?" the blonde asked with a curious expression. "I mean the way he calls for people to take arms against their own government and rise up in revolt against the secular humanists, a term fundies invented to describe anyone who's not 100% with them on every subject," Rick said passionately. "He's actually been quoted as saying that murdering doctors at abortion clinics is the Lord's will, or something like that. And don't even get me started about what he says about prayer in the classrooms, homosexuality, the teaching of evolution and the establishment of an official state religion. He does sound very disturbed," the blonde remarked. "Can't the authorities here do anything about him?" "Unfortunately they've got an army of lawyers ready to defend them against any and all legal claims you hurl against them," Rick said in disgust, which is funny since he often puts down lawyers who defend poor and minority clients in his sermons. "I mean, Jesus said a lot of things, but he was mostly into helping the poor and teaching people to tolerate one another regardless of their diversity. We're all supposed to be equals under the same system, but Taylor turns all that on its head and preaches a kind of social Darwinism where the rich and the powerful are the favored of God, while the poor are trampled underfoot because they're lazy, spineless, stupid and morally inferior. That's a specialty of Schiller's, by the way, preaching that wealth is a sign of God's favor and poverty a token of God's indifference." "How monstrous," the blonde averred. "How can people believe such nonsense?" "God only knows." Rick shook his head at the irony of his own statement, "but that's also why I stopped being a practicing Baptist. The church I grew up in may say a lot about how God works mysteriously behind the scenes to make things right, but if he's doing that then he's taking his own sweet time about getting even with slanderous pretenders like Schiller and Taylor. I know a lot of what makes these guys popular is the basic doubt and confusion about life that a lot of people have, like the world is going to hell in a handbasket on a daily basis, and when somebody provides a simple, straightforward and direct answer for all of society's ills it can be damn tempting to follow him, just like the Germans followed Hitler." "I see," the blonde looked at the man curiously, "and yet you would still defend the right of these men to preach whatever they like to the public?" "Hey, it's still a free country," Rick shrugged, "and like it or not, free speech is better than censorship. And that's not just me talking like a reporter. I just wish more people would take the time to educate themselves instead of falling into Schiller's trap of thinking that the only way to get on God's good side is to scapegoat other people. Guys like him swear up and down that God's on their side. Must make God wonder if anybody's really on his side since the people Schiller opposes are just as passionate about their own convictions. But how can you tell if one religion is closer to the truth than another?" the blonde wondered. "That's just it," Rick said, "you can't. How can anyone claim their religion is better than that of anyone else? Did God tell them it was so? And if he did, then why doesn't he come down off his throne and tell us plain which sect of Christianity, Islam or Judaism he really favors?" "I really can't say that I understand any of this," the blonde said sadly. "I am a scientist. I was trained to believe in that which I can test, demonstrate and prove in a laboratory. I've been forced to confront issues that make me doubt whether that approach alone is the only true way, but What you are describing sounds like the very antithesis of science. Revealed faith is dogmatic, no doubt about that. Rick turned a curious look towards the blonde. Excuse me for asking this, but exactly where are you from? I mean, no offense, but you do sound kind of naive. The blonde half smiled with a note of sadness. I suppose that I am. I lived a very sheltered life growing up, and it left me poorly prepared for dealing with these issues. Now Rick was more intrigued than ever, and he started to fully turn around saying, that's kind of interesting, lady, but I was going to say Midwestern. By the way, I don't think I caught your name. I'm Rick Shepard, and you? There was a startled look in her violet-colored eyes, and then she glanced away before saying, I'm Marcia. Marcia, Rick repeated, thinking to himself, no way. I'm afraid that it is. She stood up to her full height, and then Rick became aware that she was several inches taller than he was, and even as he looked her plain Jane disguise melted away to reveal the glistening form of his golden-hued goddess. Thank you for speaking with me. I found it very enlightening. I must go now, but I do hope that we will meet again, Mr. Shepard. You are a very interesting man, and your thoughts are very comforting. Also, I am sorry about the car. Phoebe and I never meant you any inconvenience. She started to turn away when Rick managed to croak out, don't go. I must. Marcia glanced towards the horizon. My powers diminished to less than half their potency at night. Something about the bioenergy being absorbed into your world's planetary body. We will speak again sometime, but for now, I must return to my friends. With that she took off into the air and started to drift away towards the city skyline, moving like a graceful bird through the air, while Rick found his knees had turned to jello and he could not risk moving as he was certain that he would fall over with a mere push. It took him some minutes to get the power of speech back once again, and then he managed to say, son of a bitch. I think I've just been had but good. Another pause gave him time to get the rest of his thoughts back online, at which point he looked up again and said, good luck, Angel. You're gonna need it. She's coming. Phoebe declared, the first words that she had uttered in the last several hours. Who with? Katie asked automatically before getting a curious look in her own eyes, at which point she's declared, Marcia. Marcia? Heather more accurately pronounced. Ah, Astardi nodded in comprehension, the prodigal returns. That is very good timing. Kathy looked nervously around, shouldn't we open a window or something? I mean, don't superheroes usually fly in through windows or bust through walls or something? No problem. Phoebe turned around. Marcia's already in the building. Oh? The man named Felipe asked, and how do you know this, Ma Sherry? Easy, Phoebe smiled. I felt her picking the lock to the door on the roof. She's coming down the stairs right now since she can use them quicker than the elevator. How very considerate, Astardi mused with a note of irony in her unearthly voice. If only all those with paranormal gifts were as thoughtful about property values. Would save a lot on repair bills, Felipe duly noted. Moments later Marcia stepped into the room, nodding apologetically towards Heather before saying, I'm sorry I took off like that, everyone. I had to sort some things out, but I feel much better now. So where did you go? Katie asked. Back to the park, Marcia explained, where I met a nice man who helped me to put my thoughts back into coherent order. A nice man? Phoebe said rather archly. Ah. Yes, Marcia said sheepishly with a glance at her beloved, only to double-take when she saw the red-headed Astardi rising smoothly up from her chair to extend a hand in her direction. Forgive me for not taking the time to introduce myself before, the redhead noted. I am Astardi Amanda Jones, and I hope that you will accept my hand in friendship as I would like to be your ally. My ally? Marcia said as she looked at the elegant hand then at the woman herself, startled to discover someone nearly as tall as herself yet possessing such unusual features as white eyes lacking irises and a pair of arching antennae. Forgive my appearance, the woman replied in that oddly quavering voice, reaching for her hat and sunglasses. I am not usually this forward on a first-time encounter. As Felipe would attest, I do try to employ a certain level of discretion in my meetings, but given the unusual nature of recent events. Ah. Yes, Marcia bowed to the redhead in Japanese fashion before straightening out again and saying, forgive my curiosity, but your eyes. Yes, the woman smiled as she re-donned her hat and sunglasses. As I was just explaining to your sensei, I share with you a rather unique status of being something of an outsider. Unlike you, however, the place that I once called home is in another dimension. Another dimension? Marcel replied. Lyasper, Astardi waved a hand towards the door and said, would you care to take a walk with me? I know that you must have many questions, and I find it more relaxing to be casual this way. Felipe, wait here, we will only be a few moments. Whatever you say, Sherry, the big, handsome man replied with his distinctly Cajun accent, and once again Marcel was a bit startled to discover that he even had a couple of inches over her and was rather solidly built for a human. She could also tell that he was packing several handguns, a mini machine gun, a shotgun, several grenades and some bladed weapons, both swords and knives, concealed upon his person, suggesting that he was ready for trouble, and yet he had an entirely relaxed and overall friendly manner. Marcel spared a glance towards Katie and Phoebe, but seeing as they had no objections she nodded to Kathy and Heather before following Astardi out of the office. Once alone with the curious redhead she found herself matching paces with her stride as they slowly moved down a corridor past the offices belonging to Playmate Enterprises, neither one of them in any particular hurry as they each seemed to be sensing the other one out in a silent moment of mutual appraisal. As though by silent consent they wound up in an indoor garden area at the center of the complex, a beautiful and relaxing spot with lush plant life giving off a comforting atmosphere with exotic flowers growing on well-tended trellises giving a pleasant sense of color to the overall soothing arrangement. Marcel very much liked this place and thought it was an excellent spot for meditation since Heather's nearly all-female staff liked to relax here during break time. Then Astardi spoke again in that voice that was like honey and thunder rolled over a voice box. You asked about my eyes, and yes, they are entirely natural for me. I am an alien, a type of demi-human native to Lyasper, though the proper term for me would actually be Schweriken, which means half-breed in my father's language. Your father? Marcel asked with lifted eyebrows. Lord Astaroth, Astardi replied with a heavy sigh, the bane of my existence. My mother was human, but I am what humans would term a type of demon, a succubus. Succubus? Marcel repeated. A demon who lives upon sexual energy, Astardi replied, much as you thrive on bioenergy. I sustain myself by having sexual relations with humans, but I never deliberately harm an innocent mortal. I only take what I need and no more than this. It is the quintessential essence of my own personal honor code and what distinguishes me from the rest of my people. You're a demon. Marcel found herself caught between skepticism and dismay, like, out of hell? Not as Christians would define the term, no, Astardi countered, but I suppose you could refer to Lyasper as a kind of hell in that my father rules it with absolute authority and has done so for many thousands of years. I am in rebellion against his dominion, but that is neither here nor there. I did not come to speak about myself and my own problems, Marcel, but rather to address myself to your own rather awkward situation. You mean about Schiller? Marcel sighed. A curious individual, Astardi remarked. He does my father's works a credit, or would do so if I suspected that they had a connection. Any time that I encounter a man who claims to speak for a just and enlightened God, yet hear him preach hate and intolerance to those who are different, I am inclined to wonder if they are not devils in disguise. One certainly cannot find much distinction between their creed and the dictates of my father. I don't quite understand, Marcel admitted. No reason why you should, Astardi replied, but consider me living proof that there is at least a kernel of truth behind the web of lives that have been spun by theologians on the subject of demonology, but if you prefer a rational explanation, then consider my kind as paradimensional life forms, beings who have coexisted alongside humanity for ages and are at the basis of a good deal of the lore about demons. You mean, like another type of alien? Marcel caught on. If you like, yes, Astardi replied. Demons have walked this world in the shadows for countless millennia, some affecting the destiny of human society, others ruthlessly taking advantage of the mythology of various cultures to conduct our affairs without social restraint or civilized compunctions. And which kind are you? Marcel asked. The kind who believes that human beings should be embraced as brothers and sisters of a less God, Astardi answered, a defender of humanity, though by my very existence the good Reverend Schiller would cast me into the role of a paragon of evil. "I can't believe that he said so many hurtful things about me," Marsaw blurted out. "It was like he was trying to drive me away, accusing me of being all sorts of things that I don't even begin to understand." "Whore of Babylon," Astarte quipped, "Jezebel, temptress, harlot. That sort of thing?" "Exactly," Marsaw nodded. "Indeed," Astarte sounded amused, "those terms would better describe me than they do, and since I am a demoness, I would say that I feel more than a little bit insulted." "Ah, I guess," Marsaw sheepishly admitted. "Do not apologize for feeling awkward, my friend," Astarte urged. "I am used to far worse insults than this, but as there is little point in returning evil for evil, I prefer to put myself above such criticisms as it is delivered by mindless drones who lack a sense of irony and anything approaching a balanced perspective." "You sound much nicer than he was," Marsaw admitted. "I pride myself on being the antithesis of my father in a great many senses of the word," Astarte noted, "and if I seem to behave with better restraint than some who call themselves Christians, then so be it. I do not pretend to be any paragon of virtue myself, and, in all honesty, I have done many things during my life for which I am deeply ashamed, mainly as I did them in the name of my own personal survival." "Yes," Marsaw glanced down, "I kind of know what that feels like." Astarte gave a pleasant chuckle, then added, "What a pair we make, you and I, exiles from our respective homelands, yet embodying the best and worst that is in humanity. And still each of us is condemned by those who would judge us for nothing more than the places of our origin, you being a child of a distant star and myself the product of an unsanctified union between demon and human. Why do people like Schiller hate us so?" Marsaw asked. "I can't believe that I've done anything that would justify his anger." "By merely existing you are an affront to his beliefs," Astarte replied. "Conservative Christianity has been in at war against science and modern civilization going back to the time of Copernicus, if not considerably further back even than that. Revealed truths do not bend so much to scientific analysis as they do to the wishes of those who desperately cling to the illusion of an enlightened past that never was. The entire history of monotheism is littered with the corpses of those who have tried to reconcile faith and reason at their most extreme ages, and it is the very fear of compromise itself that fuels their hatreds. But if they don't want to believe that I'm from another planet, then I'm not about to force them," Marsaw began to say, only to see Astarte hold up a hand to assuage her outburst. "You do not have to do anything more aggressive than to save a single life with your power while not giving thanks to Jesus Christ and his chosen apostles. That is where you challenge their authority, by being true to yourself and not conforming at all to their prejudices. The fact that others now see in you an inspiring figure of transcendent humanity makes of you an even greater challenge to the allegiance of the faithful, and if others become enraptured of the possibilities inherent in humanity itself, then they may see less of a need for priests to arbitrate between themselves and their godhood." "But I don't claim to be a god," Marsaw protested. "I don't even really know what a god is." "Consider yourself fortunate, then, that you do not have to live with one under the same rooftop," Astarte replied with a puzzling smile that hinted of faint exasperation. "It matters not what you believe yourself to be, others will see you as both goddess and angel and claim that you are a heavenly messenger, while others will decry you and insist that you are a base pretender using the powers of hell itself to confuse and delude the faithful. Believe me, I know exactly how exasperating that can be at times, though by no means do men like Schiller and Taylor represent the mainstream of organized religion." "But that's crazy," Marsaw insisted. "You are expecting a contrary argument from me?" The red-headed woman quipped, "In truth theirs is a religion of the mad, where people are exhorted to donate vast sums of money on the promise of eternity, as if they can buy the favor of their God and bask forever in the glow of life eternal." "But if what they're offering is false doctrine?" Marsaw started to say. "Can you prove that it is?" Astarte countered. "To date no one has returned from the dead to demand their money back for false advertising. In truth I have a very jaded view of such men and their activities. Petty thievery and fraudulence meant to hoodwink the gullible seem like trivial crimes when compared to the misdeeds of my father, and yet still I am moved to outrage at the injustice of their claims. Sadly, we must tolerate even the viewpoints of those whom we personally despise, since there is no one among us who is so wise and all-knowing that we can say with authority what is and is not the truth about religion." "And what do you have to say about religion?" Marsaw asked. "That religion, by definition, is the ultimate concern of all sentient beings, Astarte replied, that everyone in some way carries within them a belief in a higher power, whether you call it science or the great mysterious creator. I dare say your people most probably had a rich cultural history that was full of belief in mysticism. In truth, there are no real atheists in the world. There are merely those who doubt or deny the work of an invisible hand in the creation, which in itself constitutes a form of belief, since there is no rational way of proving that the universe is totally devoid of a higher purpose. But what do you believe? Ah, Miss Jones, was it? Marsaw asked. All me, Astarte, the other woman replied, and what I believe is that there are many gods who all share and aspect the nature of a true God who rules over all. I simply believe that the universe is too vast and complex for one intelligent mind to govern everything, and yet, as an occultist, I must believe that the various powers that do govern the universe have an intelligence that can be appealed to through prayer and invocation. That is the essential problem with monotheism, though. A polytheist such as I am can accept the existence of other worlds and other gods, but a monotheist cannot ultimately tolerate the idea that there is a power outside the dominion of his or her own religion. It must be one way or no way at all to such dualistic thinking, and from that it is a small step to argue that he who is not with me is against me. If you really want to know what I believe, though, I would say that all organized religions fall somewhat short in the end of achieving a pure and universal understanding. Only individuals can know of personal union with the divine, and for that reason religion must be a personal affair, not governed by a creed set down by a committee or a union. I suppose that I can go along with that, Miss Astarte, Marsaw said somewhat awkwardly, but still, what am I to do about Schiller if he tries to come at me like that again? Ordinarily I would caution you to do nothing, Astarte explained, giving him a forum to air his distorted views just elevates the man above his station. However, he has challenged you directly and caused you to lose face before the general public. Such a thing cannot be easily ignored nor forgiven. You must decide for yourself how you will address yourself to the problem that he poses for you, and you must act decisively if you are to change the tone of the debate. The longer this goes on, the more Schiller will be able to grow in stature, claiming vindication for his extremist views. And what would you expect me to do about it? Marsaw asked. I cannot advise you on that, Astarte replied, however. I would recommend that you turn his own weapons against him and expose him for the fraud that he is. Marsaw blinked. Excuse me? Astarte pulled something out of her jacket and handed it over to Marsaw. Read this. It should give you the answers that you seek. Marsaw stared at the object that she had just been handed, then said, the Holy Bible? No better weapon has yet been devised for overcoming the false faith of the fanatic. Astarte nodded. The Bible is a mass of self-contradictory information cribbed together over many generations from a variety of different sources, and yet it tells a very interesting, if not terribly historical, story about the evolution of an idea whose time has yet to fully arrive. Men like Schiller only claim to have read this book to gain the inspiration for their extremist views, but as you will discover for yourself, he is self-delusional, as many of his favorite pet notions are simply not to be found anywhere within the Bible. Marsaw turned the pages and began speed reading through the text, at once making a discovery that she reported to Astarte. This reads different from the Bible that Katie has in her collection. There are, to date, over 50 different versions of that book currently in existence, Astarte replied, and no two versions are entirely the same in exact wording. This volume contains the Apocrypha, for example, which is left out of the King James Version. In that section you will find the Book of Enoch, which, I believe, you will find to be very interesting indeed. Go ahead and borrow it, then bring it back to me when you are finished. Why not in another few minutes? Marsaw asked as she rapidly leafed through the pages of the cross. As long as this is, I ought to be able to digest this easily. Good luck, Astarte replied, though I imagine it would taste a little dry at first. Actually, Marsaw said sheepishly as she continued to flip through the pages, I meant that I could be done with reading this in a matter of minutes. But would you understand it as well if you simply memorized the text while speed reading? Astarte countered, slow it down and take your time to digest it, as the book itself says, pause and reflect. Do this and then we will talk again, say. This time tomorrow? All right then, Marsaw nodded, closing the book and smiling at the redhead. Where and when should I meet you? Hyde Park, around sunrise, Astarte replied, and I may even bring a friend or two along to help give you a greater perspective. I'll have to clear it with Katie," Marsaw started to say, only to see the gentle smile of the other woman. "No need," Astardi replied, "I have already obtained her permission. You are to be the guests of Heather Holberg for the night, and come the morning, we will talk at length about the future." "Sounds great," Marsaw smiled, "and thank you." "No, my friend," Astardi enigmatically replied, "thank you for trusting in me. I do hope that this will be the beginning of a mutually beneficial friendship as I find you interesting company." "I guess the same goes for you then," Marsaw replied, holding up the Bible, "and I will read this, but I'll probably also borrow a few books from Heather's own library to cross-reference as source material." Spoken as a true seeker of wisdom, Astardi bowed, then she spoke into her wristwatch and said, "Felipe, we are leaving. Meet me downstairs at the limo, and inform Elira that I will be at home in time for supper." "You got it, boss lady," came the tiny reply from the watch's receiver. Marsaw hesitated before saying, "Felipe's your bodyguard? Are you in some kind of danger?" "My entire life has been about living under the shadow of danger," Astardi replied, "but you need not fear, I am well equipped to look after myself, and I have the best protection that money and influence can buy. But that is for another time, and until then I bid you a good evening." With that the statuesque redhead took her leave of Marsaw, the latter watching her go and feeling a curious liking for the self-professed demoness, quite apart from the sense that the two of them shared a great deal in common. She glanced down at the book in her hands once again and murmured softly to herself, "I wonder what Kartor would make of all this. Gods and demons." She sighed in a tone midway between wonder and exasperation. For comments and criticisms contact me at shadowmain@ridgenet.net. Marsaw the Ultra Girl by Jim Robert Bader Book 1 Part 2 The Girl of Tungsten Steel Chapter 26 "Unholy revelations. I never thought that I'd ever admit to being licked by a library," Katie complained, "but I'm about ready to concede this battle." "Man and man," Phoebe groaned as she lay flat on her back, "let's give it a rest already. My head's so full of facts and information that I feel like I'm about to take finals." "I hear you," Kathy murmured from underneath the pillow she had over her face, laying back on the sofa in Heather's study while she moaned aloud, "I'll bet priests don't do this much studying for the seminary, and if anyone ever told me I'd be burying my nose in this many books on religion, I'd have told them to go on rehab." "The price of research is often diligence in pursuit of the raw data," Heather noted from behind her desk as she was still poring through a volume taken from one of her shelves, "and I cannot myself rest while that insufferable buffoon feels smug and free to brag about his triumph over us godless heathens, so until we find something here that can be used to turn the tables." "It's not that I don't agree with your sentiments on that," Katie replied, staring at the boxes piled on boxes full of books, notes, scrolls and reams of computer-printed data, "but frankly it could take months to sort through all this stuff, and we've only been at it for 6 hours straight." "Is it that time in the morning already?" Phoebe groaned, "Somebody just shoot me. I gave up a night of fun and debauchery for this." "Hey boss," Fiona called out as she wheeled in yet another stack of boxes, "these are the last ones from the archive, where do you want to put it?" "In the corner with the rest of the pile," Heather directed, "and thank you for working late like this. I know that it was somewhat on the spot." "Hey, no problems for me, Heather," Fiona replied, "I'd like to help out, especially if it means sticking it to that bastard, Schiller." "Then have a seat and start reading," Katie urged, "we could use more help with our research." "Research?" Kathy said as she moved her pillow, "Don't you mean mental torture?" "I'm sorry to burden you all for my sake," Marsaw spoke up from her end of the study, "but it really is necessary for me to familiarize myself with all of this information. I know that I have only been on your world for a few months, but it is long since time that I made a careful and detailed study of the subject of your world's many religions. So much that you people take for granted is all so strange and new to me, and I have yet to understand just why certain people view the world through such theology-colored lenses, since most of what you call revealed truth seems to me to be nothing more than a crude sophistry made up of equal parts of hearsay analysis and untempered supposition." "Yeah," Phoebe sighed, "that's all right for you, Marcia, but who gets stuck having to cope with the spillover of thoughts in your head? I can't block it out anymore, and it's like having Sister Batril whispering in my mind all sorts of nonsense data. "I'm sorry about that, Phoebe," Marcel replied, "and I will try to make it up to you, but... well, as a researcher I find so much of this quite fascinating, yet at the same time quite frustrating as well. For example, in the Hebrew creation story we have the being you know of as God, or Yahweh, creating the earth before the sun and the moon are in existence, and time is measured in days even though the sun isn't created until the fourth day, even though light itself is created on the first day, when day and night are officially brought into being. Not only that, but fish and birds are created on the fifth day, while land creatures come into being on the sixth, around the same time human beings come into existence. No room here for transitional forms, so it's not to wonder that theologians have such a problem with the teaching of evolution. That's an old and very tired argument, my friend, Heather sighed. So many well-meaning people of my acquaintance have tried to reconcile the seeming contradiction between the Bible story and what modern research has uncovered regarding the origins of life upon this planet, yet ultimately it all boils down to a desperate struggle to rationalize dogma in the face of intellectual challenge. "Sorry," Katie replied, "when it comes to this kind of research my karma ran over your dogma." "But wasn't that, like, an allegory or something?" Fiona wondered. After all, if there's no sun and moon to count days, a day could last an eon. "I'm afraid that argument is as specious as the one that has the devil planting a false trail of a fossil record in shale rock to confuse natural archaeologists," Heather replied. "There really is no middle ground in the end, no blending of the faith with scientific methods, and anyone who argues to the contrary is only indulging in a wishful fancy. In the end one must face the truth that the authors of the creation myth were totally ignorant about the true age of the world and the order of events in which we came into existence. God did not breathe life into Adam from the raw clay of earthly matter any more than he divinely inspired the authors to accurately record the line of events that led to a special creation." "Blasphemy," Kathy quipped. "You'll smoke a turd in purgatory for that one, boss," or something along that nature. My priest used to go on for days and nights about how the godless unbelievers were going to gnash their teeth in the afterlife when they found out how much they were pissing off God by questioning the word of the faithful. "Hey," Phoebe growled, "if God's so worried about what people believe, then he should have clarified the point about how many ages the world's been in existence. That or told Noah to build a bigger ark to fit all the dinosaurs." Creation myths seem to be typical of every ancient society that has ever existed on your world, Phoebe, Marsa noted. "My people have our own version, which turns out to be the garbled memories of our ancestors." "Why then be so upset about this one?" "Because they used to burn people at the stake for questioning dogma here, Marcia," Phoebe replied, "and pagans like me and Katie would have been tortured, then burned as witches. The Church used to rationalize its harsh attitude towards heresy by claiming concern for the welfare of the souls of their victims," Heather added. "The Church claims today that it never tortured or killed anyone, that it was always the civil authorities that carried out their wishes," which sounds rather like what Pontius Pilate said when washing his hands of that execution order. "Never could understand that one," Katie remarked, "since Pilate was a brutal man who ruthlessly carried out the policies of Caesar and never gave a damn about Jewish sensibilities, not to mention the fact that the Romans never had any policy about letting a prisoner go for the Passover." "Don't you know?" Kathy smirked. "It's a mystery, you're not supposed to understand it." "Yeah," Katie snorted, "I'll bet that line was a great comfort to anybody who wound up in front of the Inquisition." "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," Fiona quipped with a peculiarly arched tone that seemed to imply a humorous lilting. "Ha," Phoebe scoffed, "even the Marquis de Sade never claimed that torturing somebody was so good for the soul that it didn't matter what you did to the body. Me, I'd rather enjoy life while I'm in the here and now, not wind up getting sacrificed over some bogus idea about God." "But," Phoebe, Marsa argued, "there may be a basis for believing in a supernatural power. You and Katie, after all, believe in something called Wicca, and I had that experience when you died. When I felt a power. A voice. A woman's voice speaking into my mind." "Yes," Heather looked up, "I was rather fascinated about that myself." "Are you certain you didn't imagine the whole affair?" "I'm certain of it," Marcel replied. "I don't know who or what that voice was, but it was definitely real, and she gave me back Phoebe." "Hey, it's like I always said," Katie shrugged, "God is a woman." "You know, I really like that idea myself," Kathy remarked, "but how can you be so certain?" I suppose all of us will find out sooner or later when we die, Fiona mused, and maybe the scariest thing would be to find out that the fundies were right all along. Ever think about that? Not really, Katie said. I know exactly what I've done in my life, both the good and the bad, and I can live with most of it. Besides, if a male god like Yahweh's even half the bastard that the Bible stories make him out to be, then he's got a lot more to answer for than you and me and the rest of us sinners put together. You've got that right, Kathy murmured. In the Old Testament he comes across as an angry, bad-tempered old prude who never lifts a finger to help anyone who can't ultimately do him a return favor. Don't even get me started on that, Katie growled. I may have been born Jewish but I was never Orthodox, and I've seen plenty of blood get spilled in the name of religion. My people and the Palestinians have been feuding for almost 60 years just because we can't agree on who God favored with the land rights, but we both claim descent from the children of Abraham. Actually, Marsa spoke up again, that in itself is a subject of some dispute according to what the scholars that I've been reading. The Bible about Abraham and his sister wife, Sarah leaving the land of Ur of the Chaldees seems rather apocryphal given how ancient the story is and the complete absence of any supporting archaeological record. The story about him hearing a voice that told him to head south into the promised land of Palestine, which was already inhabited even in those days, Heather duly noted. Exactly, Marsa noted, giving land that belongs to someone else hardly seems like the behavior of a just and honorable deity. And then there are stories told here about Abraham, or Abraham, that just don't make any kind of sense, such as the 2 separate occasions when he pretends that he and his wife are not married so that he can avoid being killed when a powerful man covets his wife for himself. And let's not forget that famous act of child abuse when God almost had him sacrifice his son, Isaac, Kathy further noted. Exactly, Marsa noted, Yahweh promises to make him the father of a great kingdom, then tells him to go forth into land that belongs to the people now known as the Canaanites, and there he settles on the plains of Moor, which doesn't correspond at all with the geological features of the Palestinian region. He wanders around a lot in and out of Egypt and Arabia before his nephew settles down in one of a pair of city-states near to the Dead Sea, which again makes no sense as archaeologists have never been able to find any evidence that a city was ever there in the first place. That is because the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is pure nonsense, Heather answered. It was based on garbled memories passed down over generations as a morality play, but it's lost a lot of its real value in the retelling. So what is the real story? Phoebe asked. That's easy, Fiona replied. Somebody nuked them. Weren't they, like, punished by God for being wicked places of debauchery and carnal lust? Kathy half-seriously wondered. Hardly, Heather sniffed. The plains spoken of in the Bible were never located in Palestine. A research team some time ago traced their actual origins to Babylon itself, or rather to a city called Al-Akwar located between the twin rivers known as the Tigris and the Euphrates. The mistranslation about a sea of salt has misled researchers for centuries, just as always happens when historians attempt to bend their research in order to conform with the stories of the Bible. Which they often try to do, Katie sniffed. Imagine how many guys try to make sense of the Old Testament stories but never think about consulting an authentic Jewish scholar, somebody steeped in both archaeological and the history of the region. Just so, Heather agreed, the actual city was a center of worship for the Babylonian god Negro, the consort to the death goddess, Kernobog. It also happened to be located over one of the largest deposits of natural gas in the entire region of what is now a part of Iraq, gas deposits that sometimes bubbled up to the surface during natural land shifts, and on one such occasion it took nothing more than a spark to ignite this gas and set fire to an entire city. The fire was recorded as bursting out in hundreds of locations almost simultaneously, which hardened the mud buildings and effectively preserved them for the ages. There was no sign of war or looting at the location, nor any trace of a mass grave of charred bodies, meaning that the place was shortly thereafter abandoned as accursed of the gods by the survivors. Moral of the story there, Fiona smiled, don't build houses over large gas deposits. But what about that stuff about the 2 angels and the mob that wanted to have sex with him and all that? Phoebe asked. Yet another translation error, Heather replied. Consider that Sodom and Gomorrah had recently been attacked by the 5 cities of the plain, again a reference to the Babylonian area. Abraham and his shepherds had helped to drive off the scourge, making Lot an automatic hero to the people, But the memory of having so many of their citizens be roped into bondage could not have sat well with the survivors, so when a pair of strangers show up in town, a committee of concerned citizens quite naturally came calling to ask for their identities. As Lot did not want to yield up guests to such an inquisition, being that it went against the custom of hospitality to your guests, he naturally tried to bribe these citizens by offering up his 2 virgin daughters in trade. When the citizens refused, well, that is where the story alleges that the angels blinded the people and set fire to the city, but I leave it up to you to decide which explanation best fits the facts here. Of course his daughters weren't too thrilled about almost getting gang raped, Katie noted, so after they lost their mother to the fire they got their father good and drunk and then got laid, and sometime later they gave birth to their sons Moab and Ben-Ammi, the fathers of the Moabites and Ammonites, whom God later ordered destroyed by the Israelis. Just like the Israelis were later commanded to exterminate the Midianites, Amalekites, Jebusites and the entire tribe of Benjamin, all at God's direction, Heather further added, total genocide and ethnic cleansing of the entire region, yet when the Israelis failed in this mission God was angry and punished them with the diaspora. And yet none of this ever really happened according to history and the archaeological record, Marsaw related, there is no trace of widespread genocidal war at any time within the region. Nor did the Israelis appear to have any serious cultural or religious disputes with their neighbors prior to the 7th century BC, when they were alleged to have become a divided kingdom. In fact, the entire story from Joshua on down relates a series of battles and conquests that are utterly absent from any other source material, and even Jericho was already in a state of ruins before the first Israeli is even mentioned in the chronicles of the Egyptians or the Assyrians. So we didn't do a good enough job of exterminating those people. Katie shrugged. If God wanted them exterminated she should have done the job herself. And then there is the city of Jerusalem, which doesn't even factor in prominently as a significant metropolis prior to the 8th century BC. According to the archaeological records there was nothing more than a hill fort guarding a well on that location during the time when King David was alleged to have founded a powerful nation along important trade routes. In reality the only trade going on was taking place up north in the northern Palestine region. The lands to the south were desolate wastes where only goat herders dwelled. Then, too, there is the even more confusing story about Moses, the Egyptian, whose entire exploits are in no way confirmed by any other source material, especially in the chronicles of the Egyptians. That's because Moses was a carnival huckster with delusions of measurehood. Katie snorted. Egypt was once ruled by a group of Semites called the Hyksos, but a couple of centuries before Moses came along the Hyksos were overthrown by the pharaoh Ahmose, who drove them all the way into the land of Canaan. He founded the 18th dynasty and ruled over both the lands of Egypt and Canaan, but several generations later a successor named Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten and created the first cult of monotheism that lasted only one generation before the priests put an end to that nonsense. That's the thing I never did like about monotheism, Fiona spoke up while leafing through a volume. Priests with political ambitions always make themselves insufferable, but with many gods the competition keeps them halfway honest. But when I visited Ireland with my mother I found her homeland rife with sectarian strife with two sides arguing about which one has the better claim on the exact same god, and all because of some inbred Egyptian who fancied himself a prophet. Yes, Marsaw agreed, and according to these books, Egypt suffered a serious decline and a loss of influence during Akhenaten's reign, but when the priests of the old gods regained power they drove the followers to Akhenaten into exile. And one of those monotheist guys was Moses? Phoebe asked. Possibly, Heather replied. It would explain a lot, such as why there has never been any trace of the multitude of slaves supposedly liberated from bondage having crossed over into the Palestine region, while the priestly tribe of Levi that Moses belonged to was the only one without an ancestral territorial land claim. The Bible story alleges that Moses led a horde numbering over 2 million across the Red Sea into Arabia. Ha! Katie snorted, not even a tenth of that. And that's another translation error some hack in the early Christian church screwed up badly. The actual Hebrew words mean sea of reeds, in other words a swamp, and if the Egyptians followed the Israelis into that then their chariots would have gotten bogged down in the mud. Parting the Red Sea just so a bunch of immigrants could walk along the bottom may work for the movies, but I don't think you could even drive a truck across that length in less than a day, let alone move a couple million people. You mean that you, as a Jew, can accept the idea that the story about Moses is a complete myth?" Kathy marveled. "Not only that," Katie replied, "but I'd even go so far as to compare the guy to the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, think about it. He leads a bunch of city-bred people into a wilderness without time enough to bake a decent loaf of bread, feeds them on some yucca plant homespun that they call manna from heaven, brings them all the way to a mountain in the land of the Midianites, then goes away for a couple of months to talk to God, and when he gets back he finds the people are worshipping the moon goddess Hathor and praying to return back to Egypt. So what does he do about it? Gathers a bunch of his friends and goes on a murderous killing spree that cows his followers into submission. He then leads them on a 40-year death march that winds up killing off the old guard and raising up a new army of dedicated fanatics in their place, who in turn get turned loose on the civilized peoples of the land of Canaan. I mean, what does that sound like to you? The birth of civilization? I would hardly classify it as that," Marsaw said, "and Jewish civilization does not appear to begin until well after the fall of the city of Lachish and the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Jerusalem appears to be a simple client state governed by a local king until the time of Hezekiah, who claimed to have found some scrolls in a temple that pronounced the laws known as Leviticus to the Jewish people." "Rather convenient that," Katie sniffed. "I wonder if the ink was even dry when they found them." And yet his attempted reforms caused him to lay waste to the rival temples of his Assyrian overlords, Marsaw continued, who then came down from the north and lay waste to the entire southern region, forcing Hezekiah to pay a massive tribute that puts an end to his attempted revolt. Then, 4 generations later, a descendant of his named Josiah attempts the same thing all over with even more disastrous consequences. By the time the 5 primary books of the Old Testament are written and later on get redacted together into one story during the Babylonian exile and the subsequent diaspora. In other words, the entire history of the Israelis up to that point is subject to dispute and cannot be verified by any single independent document. "Until you get to the time of the Maccabees," Katie said, "who are even more Taliban-like in their rejection of the Greek-influenced Seleucid Empire." "But what does any of this mean, Marcia?" Phoebe asked. "Not all Jews owe a debt to history over what took place over 2,000 years ago." "I never said that they were at fault for anything, Phoebe," Marsaw replied. "I simply find all of this quite fascinating, even given that it is ridiculous to hold an entire culture at fault for the sins committed by their forefathers. And yet without history you can't really understand how the whole mess about organized religion got started," Marcia, Kathy noted. "Yes, and so much of what is known about the history of the region contradicts the Old Testament in a very significant manner," Heather Dooley noted with a tired shaking of her long mane of blonde hair. "You can see now why this research can at times be so infuriating for the historian and archaeologist to pore through and then attempt to explain to the average layman, and we are only just begun scratching the surface here. There are literally hundreds of documents and historical sources that must be compiled together to create a true and proper profile of the actual evolution of Judaism as a modern-day religion. But this only covers the basis for founding the concept of a single God as a major religious notion," Marsaw said, "and much of that seems to have been loosely borrowed from Persian Zoroastrianism, particularly the dualist concept of an opposing force of evil in the form of Ahriman, or Satan." "Satan's got nothing to do with authentic Judaism," Katie insisted. "Real Jews don't need a rival power to challenge the authority of Jehovah as the supreme being of the cosmos. Jehovah's more than enough as a source of both good and bad things that he doesn't need any help from a devil." "The devil's in the details, my friends," Fiona remarked, "and when you're Irish on your mother's side, like me, then you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between God and the devil." "But this still doesn't tell me anything about what Schiller and his people mean when they talk about religion," Marsaw sighed, setting the book she had been reading back on the shelf where she had found it. "The Old Testament may have been a work of fiction, but the books that comprise the New Testament seem all to revolve around a historical figure named Jesus of Nazareth." "Oh, I can tell you all about him, Marcia," Katie informed her, "not that there's much to tell since he never really existed." "Say what?" Fiona looked up. "Excuse me?" Kathy blinked. "You sure about that?" "Absolutely," Katie replied. "There never was a guy named Jesus Christ from the town of Nazareth, just like there was never a town called Nazareth until some locals saw a great way to make some money by declaring their village an official tourist stop for pilgrims. The story's just the invention of a guy named Saul of Tarsus, who was hardly even authentically Jewish. His stories got nothing at all to do with history. It was all made up by a bunch of people who lived decades after the alleged events and who never actually lived through any of it or even knew anything about the Palestine that existed when Jesus was supposedly on his mission. Saul made the whole thing up to justify his crude attempt to synthesize Judaism with his own pagan beliefs since he started out as a follower of Mithraism. "Now surely you must be joking," Heather reacted. "Jesus, whoever he was a highly influential figure who inspired one of the great faiths of all time." "Oh, there was a guy who people now call Jesus the Christ," Katie replied, "but his real name was Yesus ben Yusuf. He was a Nazarene, somebody who followed the tradition of not cutting your hair or shaving, a Jewish rabbi who followed the Pharisaic tradition of tending to the poor and oppressed of Jewish society, unlike the ruling Sadducees, who were pro-Roman. Yesus taught a doctrine of inclusion and tried to heal a deep rift that existed in the Jewish state during the Roman occupation. His message survived in a bunch of sayings that got recorded in a scroll now called the Book of Thomas, and what we can make out from those is that he preached that the spirit was more important than the body, that the things which unite us are more important than the things that divide us, and that holiness is found in trying to live a good life, not in making loud boasts about how devoted you are to paying alms to the temple." "Why do you say that this Jesus existed but not Jesus?" Marsaw asked. "Because Jesus is a Greek word, and badly mispronounced," Katie replied. "Greek and Latin don't have J's in their consonants, and neither does Hebrew or Aramaic. That means that Jesus is a made-up mistranslation of the name Jesus, but it's also the name that's been used for centuries to persecute and convert my people." "Yeah," Fiona reluctantly nodded, "I can see how that would kind of taint things for you." "Jesus is also the transcendent figure of Christian mythology," Heather replied. "God made flesh and manifest, the living embodiment of God as a man, and thus the savior of humanity, or so the Christians tell us." "Hogwash," Katie dismissed. "Jews don't believe in the concept of original sin, and who in their right mind could believe that all of humanity was damned for all time because of a mistake by our ancestors? That apple story was a slander against Eve, a myth that says that women are supposed to be submissive to men because it's all our fault for tempting Adam. But what God worthy of being worshipped creates men and women and gives them the ability to feel pleasure only to say that it's a bad thing? Especially when sex is the way in which we all came into being. I mean, what would humanity be without sex? Extinct, that's what. So you don't buy it that Jesus suffered on the cross to redeem the sins of the world and went to hell for 3 days and all that?" Kathy asked. "Pardon me while I retch," Fiona made gagging noises. "You tell me how one guy suffering on the cross is gonna make up for all the pain and suffering that all people have experienced throughout the ages?" Katie demanded. "And if dying on the cross is supposed to redeem all Christians, then why aren't they noticeably better people than non-Christians? Why are there just as many criminals among true believers as there are proportionally among atheists? Why do so many Christians go mad and kill their whole families while quoting from the Bible? How can holy wars exist if God's so powerful that he could put a stop to things by telling his followers to knock it off and stop blaming him for all their problems? For over 1,000 years the Catholic Church ran the show in Europe and tried to exterminate Jews for being Christ killers, but God didn't do anything about that, any more than he prevented Hitler from bringing on the Holocaust. So you tell me why I should believe that Jesus is the savior of humanity? He sure didn't do anything for his fellow Jews when it really could have mattered. But why then do so many people believe that Jesus is a god if they have no evidence about him?" Marsaw asked. "Hey, that one's so easy even I can answer it," Phoebe replied. "You don't need proof to believe in something when you really desperately need to believe in something." "Huh?" Marsaw blinked. "You've just lost me." "So much for the two-way mind meld," Kathy softly chuckled, setting aside her pillow. "What she means is that people have this really deep need to believe in some kind of spiritual or transcendent value, Marcia. Very few guys I know can tolerate the idea of a totally dead universe in which we're utterly all alone and without somebody out there to care for us. Even if we have to invent an imaginary friend who loves and forgives us for all our failures and imperfections and stuff, it's better than having nothing and no one to believe in. And there is the rub," Heather sighed, "to try and convince people who need to believe in a Messiah that they need to believe first in themselves and then see that we are all a part of something greater, something divine that links us all as humans." "Something transcendent?" Marsaw replied. "Something greater than flesh and blood, something that comes from the spirit, from within, Yeah, Katie replied, but without the hokey mumbo-jumbo that the church uses to fleece people, like believing that God will cast them all into hell unless they crawl on their hands and knees begging for mercy and forgiveness and hoping that the selfish creep will even pay them any attention. Cool it, Katie, Phoebe said as she sat upright. Marsha's confused enough as it is without your usual rant about the Lions and the Christians. Let's just say that the fundies are the real problem here, and guys like Schiller who take advantage of the gullible sheep they fleece. Basically you got on the one hand a bunch of confused and ignorant people who talk and act like robots hooked on Valium, and on the other hand a bunch of guys who talk like used car salesmen trying to sell you on the idea that there's this invisible man who lives up in the sky who sees and hears everything and has this cosmic lists of do's and don'ts, and if you break any one of his big no-nos, then he throws you into a pit of eternal suffering forever and ever. But he loves you. Kathy chimed, joining Phoebe and Fiona as they caroused, and he wants money. Lots and lots of money. You three should take it on the road, Heather mused. Actually the true fundamentalist believes in the concept of the end of days, an imagined time of the future when the forces of light and darkness will meet in a final battle to decide the fate of eternity, and the side that wins, God's side, inherits a universe purged of all evil, while the losing side, the side of the devil, spends 1,000 years in turmoil and then just ceases to exist. Oblivion for the fallen, a life of bliss and contentment for the saved. Sounds like communism to me. Katie sat upright. The thing about Christianity is that it claims to be divinely guided by the teachings of Jesus, but as Jesus himself was quoted to say, "By their fruit shall ye know them," and the fruit of fundamentalism is very bitter indeed. You got that right, Fiona rolled her eyes. First they want your mind, then they want your wallet, and then they possess you body and soul. It's like they sign their names in blood or something when they enter the church roster, and the kinds of things they do in the name of their warped ideas about God. All the while claiming that Jesus is their personal Lord and Savior, Kathy noted, and that belief in him protects them from evil. But how can that be? Marsha asked, how can the teachings of a man who preached tolerance and peace produce followers who stress exactly the opposite? He who is not with me is against me, Fiona quoted. It's like that with every religion. You have your sincere believers, and then you have your mind-fucked drones goose-stepping along to the same exact choir. I'm afraid that is more or less correct, Heather sighed. Religion is meant to inspire one and uplift the spirit, but fundamentalism enslaves the soul and locks the mind into the trap of absolute certainty. Dogma is denial of the ability of the seeker to find their own personal truth within religion, and it is blind trust placed in the words of people long dead and beyond contradicting. Hey, it's like I said before, Katie remarked, blame it on Saul. He's the one who turned Jesus into Jesus in the first place. How do you mean that? Fiona asked. Saul was from a Romanized town called Tarsus, Katie replied. He was raised among pagans and got exposed at an early age to the pagan ideals of the Persian cult of Sol Invictus Mithras. He tried to get more in touch with his Jewish roots but failed to make the entrance exams and wound up getting a job at the temple as a part of their security guard system. He later wrote a cock-and-bull story claiming to be a student of the Pharisaic scholar known as Gamaliel, but his writing is so fragmentary and jumbled with many misquoted lines and self-contradictions that he comes across as a sophomoric imbecile who would never have made it out of grade school. No way could he have been a top-notch religious scholar like he claimed to be, especially since his understanding of Judaism was laughably pathetic. How do you mean that? Heather asked, visibly intrigued. Well, take for example his ideas about the Eucharist, Katie explained. It was a mythic ritual involving the use of wafers and wine that are mysteriously transmuted into the blood and flesh of Mithras. He made that the central-most pillar of his ideas about the mission of Jesus and described the Last Supper in those terms. Only it's against Jewish law to drink blood even in symbolic rituals, and eating the flesh of a dead man is cannibalism. That's why Jews everywhere were horrified by Saul's message and wanted to stone him. But he claimed Roman citizenship on his father's side and appealed to Caesar for justice. That's when he started writing those stupid epistles of his out of a jail cell, trying to defend his activities and justify himself by claiming to be an unknown disciple of Jesus. But why would he have lied about being a religious scholar? Marsha asked. Patting his resume, Fiona replied, most men do tend to lie when you catch them with their pants down. Exactly, Katie said. He lied about his training in Judaism because he was on trial for his life, and he colored his epistles with misquotations from Gamaliel and other Pharisaic scholars, claiming ties to the Jerusalem-based movement of the apostles and claiming his authority came straight from Jesus himself. Problem is, in a lot of areas, he directly contradicts Jesus. In what way? Heather asked. Well, there's a lot of little things he says that run contrary to the quotes in the Gospel of Thomas, Katie remarked, but the key difference is that Jesus stresses that he is not out to change the laws of Moses but to fulfill the prophecy of something he called the Son of Man, which is not the same thing as the Messiah. But Saul, who later calls himself Paulos, wanted to include non-Jews in his mission and wound up undermining the authority of Leviticus by saying that the laws of Moses were not important, or not as important as simply believing in Jesus as the Son of God, which was blasphemy in those days since most Jewish scholars would have argued that God could not be incarnated as a mere mortal, let alone a criminal executed for claiming to be their king. So Paul lied about his mission, Phoebe sniffed, or maybe he was just crazy enough to think that he really had met Jesus. You wouldn't know it to go by what he considered his mission, Katie said, and Paul, not Peter or the other apostles, is the real founder of Christianity. Hell, the word Christos was coined by him when he started out in Antioch. And that business he said about persecuting Christians and carrying letters of arrest into Syria? More bullshit. Antioch wasn't under direct Roman authority, they were an ally and an officially recognized client state. No way could even the Sanhedrin authorize the arrest of members of an outlawed sect, so Saul couldn't possibly have had official backing at the time that he was riding out to Damascus. But wait, Kathy raised a finger, weren't the Pharisees the enemies of Jesus? No way, Katie shook her head, the Pharisees weren't the party in power controlling the Sanhedrin, they were more like country rabbi who preached to the common people a moderate message about love, tolerance and faith, very much the same things that Jesus talked about. In fact, I'd bet even money that Jesus was a Pharisee, just like I'm positive that he was married and had a kid by his wife, Mary of Magdala. The prostitute? Fiona asked. Show me where in the Bible it calls her that, Katie sniffed. She was only described as a woman out of whom 7 demons were cast by Jesus, which is a neat way of alluding that she had a shady past, possibly as a former worshipper of Belial, the fertility goddess. The thing you've got to remember is that Jewish law required that a rabbi had to be married, and if a woman was found alone with a man who wasn't a relative or her husband she could get stoned to death as an adulteress. The fact that Jesus was called the rabbi at the time and that adultery was never listed among the crimes he's alleged to have committed, it goes to follow that he was following Jewish law and had a wife to support him since Jewish women were the ones who controlled the family finances. A sensible system, Heather remarked. Far better than letting a man have control of the family fortune. Yeah, well, wives supported their husbands while they went off to study the Talmud, Katie explained, and rabbis were also required to have a job skill that they could use to generate money on the side, like, say, carpentry. But if it sounds like a stretch to think of Jesus as a married man, keep in mind that he had a Jewish mother who was very much alive at the time, and to think of any guy living to the age of 30 without his Jewish mom arranging a marriage would have been a miracle to blow away that loaves and fishes thing. Also too, Heather noted, recall that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is described as the bridegroom at the wedding of Canaan. Right, Katie said, the guy was obviously storing wine for a big party he was planning on having later with his buddies, but they ran out of the regular stuff, so Jesus' mother told him to break out the good stuff, which was hidden away in jars that were supposedly full of water. No miracle there, just the way you tell a story whose moral is that you should serve guests the good stuff first and leave the bad stuff for later when you're too drunk to know the difference. Oh really? Fiona asked with interest. Then what about the loaves and fishes, or the walking on water? Don't really know about them, Katie shrugged. They might be miracles, or maybe they just found a lot of fish in a hurry and had a bakery sale going near where Jesus was giving a speech. Walking on water is easy, you just run very, very fast and know where all the loose stones are. What about healing the sick and helping the blind to see? Kathy wondered. Medical knowledge wasn't very good back then, so a little knowledge would seem like a miracle, though faith healing is possible. Katie waved a hand at Marsaw, but when it comes to healing lepers, Jewish society had 2 kinds, those with a disease and those who got treated like pariahs. Judaism is obsessed with cleanliness and purity, and if someone does an unclean act they have to atone for it and seek God's forgiveness. If someone came along and told a social pariah that they were forgiven, it would be considered the same as curing a leper. As for casting out demons and performing exorcisms, heck, any halfway competent spiritualist could do that in Japan. What about raising Lazarus and the resurrection on the cross? Heather wondered. Lazarus sounds like a mystical initiation ritual where the initiate pretends to be dead before awakening into a new spiritual life, Katie replied, but raising the dead ain't exactly all that novel, and lots of mystical traditions have yogis and fakirs who claim to be able to do the exact same thing. As for that business with the cross, well, the alternative view to believing it's a miracle is that Jesus faked his death on the cross with a sponge full of drug vinegar, which made him pass out after only being on the cross for a couple of hours. A Roman centurion prodded him with a spear to confirm he was dead, and he bled like a living man, not a corpse. Then, in total contradiction of usual Roman practice, they let the family take the body for burial rather than to leave it to rot, which was what the Romans did with everybody else. Maybe the family bribed Pontius Pilate, then wrapped the body in a cloth soaked with aloe vera, which most definitely was not the normal burial practices of the Jews and was only done with a living body. A couple of days later, when Jesus revives from his trance, he's healed up enough to move to a safe hiding place, and hence the empty burial chamber. When he shows up a few days after his alleged death, appearing before his followers in the flesh, he's still pretty weak but is strong enough to say that he's come back from the dead in order to fulfill prophecy, and who's gonna doubt him besides Thomas? Then he flees into Egypt and isn't heard again until Masada, at which point he finds out about the Paulines and what they've been preaching in his name, but since he's an old man at the time, who'll believe that he's the real Jesus? That is certainly a very interesting way of interpreting the traditions, Heather murmured in a thoughtful tone of voice. Hey, now you guys know what I've had to go through on a regular basis, Phoebe grinned. 6 years of getting a crash course on Bible stories, and I think I finally started to build up a tolerance for the stuff. Either that or I'm just tripping. But what makes you so sure that the story in the Bible is just a myth? Fiona wondered. Because for Christianity to be the ultimate truth, then every other religion in the world would have to be false, Katie said flatly, and people who never heard the name Jesus would be damned to hell for all eternity. Your people on Wolframa would all be automatically damned for the rest of time, Marcia, and everybody who ever lived before Jesus would be similarly bound for hell, unless God granted them special dispensation. Good point, Kathy sniffed. I know my friend, the one who committed suicide, was denied normal church burial rites because killing yourself is a sin, but I remember her as a very sweet and caring person, and I could never believe that was so evil that she deserved eternal damnation. Marcia looked thoughtful before turning to Katie before saying, so what you have told me so far is that a myth grew up around a man who only wanted people to be more tolerant of one another, and yet it is a myth that has great power. Over 1 billion people believe that this Jesus was a god. Not just any god, Katie said, the God above all gods, before whom no other god can exist and all that. Then you have the Muslims, who think that Jesus was a prophet and Muhammad followed after him, and their ideas have their roots in Jewish tradition since they claim to be the children of Abraham through Ishmael, his firstborn son. Add to that the Eastern and Western Orthodox churches, the Protestants and Mormons, the Scientologists and saucer freaks, and then you get to the Buddhists and the Hindu before you get down to the Shinto beliefs that I've studied in Japan. I think I get what you mean, Fiona remarked. No one god can please everybody, just like the Loyalists and the Catholics in Belfast can't even agree on which holidays to celebrate. After a while you begin to wonder if God even listens to their prayers anymore, or maybe he was never there to begin with. Oh, I'm not saying that there is no God, Katie assured them, but I think that the real God must be a woman, and the Christian notions about God just make no sense when they call everybody else's ideas phony. Marcia turned away, her expression unusually grim, and she glanced out the window before saying, I think we have studied enough for one night, but I look forward to the morning and my next meeting with Astarte. She is a very curious woman, and I have the oddest sense about her. Like an evil? Kathy asked. No, Marcia replied, definitely not evil, though I sense a great evil is hovering around her like a shadow, as if she were in terrible danger and needed protection. Beyond what that hired bodyguard of hers could provide. Oh yeah, Phoebe smiled, handsome guy, built like a rock and with a face like a male model. Oh yeah, Fiona smiled, Now that's the kind of bodyguard that I'd hire if I was worth $750 million. He's gay, Katie offhandedly declared. Huh? Phoebe blinked. What makes you say that? Because he spent several hours around us and never even checked any of us out, Katie explained, but the minute he passed by a cute guy his eyes went swerving like a refrigerator magnet. Good call, Katie remarked. Felipe is more than just a bodyguard, he's a special friend of Astarte's, but they're not romantically involved since we happen to know that Astarte's as big a dyke as me. Really? Phoebe said, then blinked. And she's interested in Marcia? Down girl, Katie cautioned, don't get your feelers up so fast until you know her intentions. It will be all right, Phoebe, Marcia assured her. I don't think Astarte is interested in me in that sense, but if she does make it a point then I'll inform her that I am already committed. You'd better, huh? Phoebe blinked again then said, committed? Oh, Fiona smirked. Somebody said the dreaded C word. But I think dear Marcia has an excellent idea just the same. Heather nodded. It's late, we're tired and we've been poring over old tomes so long that I'm feeling like going Old Testament on Schiller's ass. Ooh, kinky, Katie smiled. You want I should get the butt plug and hose so we can give him an enema? It was a testament to how late it was and the tired state of mind that she was in that Heather actually paused to consider the suggestion, then at last dismissed it with a sigh. Some other time. For now to bed, and by that I do mean sleeping. AWWWW. Katie pouted. Yes, to bed, Marcia agreed, smiling at Phoebe and Katie, though in her mind there was a different issue at stake beyond the sharing of comfort and warmth, her thoughts flashing over the information that she had just absorbed in one night, knowing that she had to process it through meditation if she were to make sense of the whole affair, assuming that anything sensible could result of so much contradictory data. She hoped that Astarte might have the answers that she was seeking, but in truth she doubted that it could be all that simple, and with the hateful words of Schiller still echoing in her mind she knew that the coming day would mean a confrontation was in the offing. She had to resolve the mystery and soon over what these others called religion, though never before this day had she ever felt so out of place and alien to their culture. But if the answers that she sought were to be found with the sultry demoness, then perhaps it was fate that had brought the both of them together. Fate or a common destiny, and whatever came of the morning she knew that she was taking a larger step beyond the sphere of her own knowledge, and if at the end a greater mystery awaited then she would have to face it directly, just as she had done from the moment she set foot on her new homeworld, hoping as always that the new day would hold a bright and better future. It was early the following morning with the sun only just beginning to climb over the horizon. Marcia found Astarte standing a short distance away from a parked stretch limousine, posed along a rail overlooking a rise in the park that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyscape. Marcia descended with hardly a sound and came to rest a short distance from the mysterious redhead, nodding slightly towards the nearby Felipe, who nodded back in token acknowledgement. However, before she even had a chance to speak she heard the unearthly rumble of the sultry demonic heiress. So, Astarte said without turning around, you've indulged your passion for research and applied your intellect to the solution of a problem, and what has that formidable mind of yours accomplished so far, my dear friend? Nothing, Marcia said as she stood lightly off to the right and behind the leather-clad redhead. All I managed to do was convince myself that Schiller and his kind are even crazier than I'd suspected. I mean, what man ransoms his soul to have power and riches while ignoring the most basic tenets of the religion he professes to adhere to? A most interesting point, Astarte replied as she studied the sunrise set against the bay, and I would say that such a man is as much a lost soul as anyone to whom he professes his devotion. Such a man turns to religion for answers, but the answers he seeks are not to be found in any book of Revelations, and by turning his mind over to the words of dead prophets he admits to the weakness of distrusting his own wisdom. Indeed, it is a cardinal point with these fundamentalists that human wisdom is not to be trusted, that questioning the authority of the Bible is tantamount to doubting the authority of their God, and as such is blasphemy and forever to be avoided. Yet you and I, as outsiders, can see things from a different light and ask the questions that they dare not to ask, seek the answers that they dare not consider, and perceive the possibilities that are beyond the limits of their understanding. Marcia looked at the other woman's profile before saying, you knew what I would find even before you gave me this Bible. She held it out in hand. You let me form my own conclusions after reading all of the books that I could find on the subject. Astarte half turned to regard her. I anticipated that you would not be able to rest until you formed your own conclusions. So tell me, my friend, what is it that have you discovered? That what Katie said was the truth, Marcel replied. There really is a major difference between Christianity and the life of Jesus ben Yusuf. That for most of the last 2,000 Earth years a totally false doctrine invented by a psychotic visionary has ruled the lives of people who ought to know better. That monotheism itself is an irrational idea that perversely claimed hold over human imagination some time ago, and that I really am a stranger to this and the type of thinking that would surrender free will to the authority of something so deeply perverted. Your mentor, Katie, does not know everything, Astarte cautioned. There is more to the story of Jesus than either of you know, more than you can know since the facts have been suppressed and the knowledge considered so dangerous that it cannot be entrusted to ordinary people. So, what is the truth? Marcel asked. Was he a god or a man? Define God. Astarte now fully turned to regard Marcel, and this time she was not using her sunglasses to conceal her unearthly eyes, looking up into Marcel's puzzled expression before adding, mortals speak a lot about things for which they can have no direct knowledge, but my people are a bit closer to the source, being long-lived and insightful, and I have had access to records not available to the denizens of this plane of reality. As such I can tell you with some authority that Jesus, call him by whatever name you will, once did live and breathe and doubt himself the same way as you and I might do. If little else told about him is true, then the myth is still a story about inspiration and promise. On that level it can be taken seriously as gospel, and the rest is mere elaboration. Marcel stared at the opaque eyes of the other woman, attempting to see past their milky exterior and failing in spite of her greatly enhanced senses. Why go round with subtlety and riddles? Why not just come out and say what you mean directly? Forgive me, the redhead replied, but I rather doubt that you would be inclined to take the word of a self-admitted demonist that there is a purpose behind religion, all religions. After all, consider the source. My kind are known to be deceitful and treacherous. I try not to judge anyone on appearance, Marcel assured her. And pleased am I to hear this, Astarte smiled enigmatically, but still. Can you honestly say that it would mean as much to you if I gave you my side of the matter rather than have you arrive at your own conclusions? Understand, I have nothing but the highest respect for your intellect, and so I trusted you to be as inquisitive as I once was when searching for my answer. And what answers have you found? Marcel asked her. That an old earth poet once said it best, Astarte replied, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Or perhaps I should say that you should first examine what it is that you believe before deciding what is and is not possible, my dear Marcel of Nidjarma. What I believe? Marcel asked in surprise. It is as good a place to begin as any other, Astarte informed her. For example, your people long ago discovered that the universe itself appears to behave in a manner that suggests an orderly or coherent state that underlies the seeming chaos of our existence. How did you know that? Marcel asked in surprise. I read it in one of your articles, Astarte replied. Being a friend of Heather's, I naturally had reserved an advanced copy of the magazine that you and she have had published. Well, Marcel said somewhat awkwardly, it is true that we believe in a hidden order to existence, just as reality itself is subject to manipulation by subtle influences that we call the invisible attractors. And do these hidden attractors not imply that there is a state resembling intelligence underlying the cosmos as we perceive it? Astarte persisted, just as the imaginary wall separating the subject from the observer does not actually exist on a quantum state of reality? That by changing our perceptions of reality we can have an unconscious effect upon the reality of our observance? Well, Marcel replied, it's true that there is no line of separation between any 2 points in our reality. And then there is the curious phenomena, which you related, regarding the survival of your lover, Astarte continued. According to you, at the moment when you doubted yourself, when your own powers seemed insufficient to revive her, a voice answered your call and gave her back to you. Does that not seem rather curious if, in fact, there is no higher power than our own intelligence? I think I see what you're getting at, Marcel said, but I'm not sure if I'd characterize it as intelligence if you mean to imply that as proof of a higher being. What about a reflective being who embodies our thoughts, hopes, wishes and aspirations? Astarte continued, have you never wondered about the phenomenon of a group mindset, the effect created when dozens, if not hundreds of people, all concentrate on the exact same thing at approximately the same time, much as fans at a rock concert focus their attention towards a stage and the performers who reside upon it? So much concentration, in effect, that the performer feels uplifted? I don't really know about that, Marcel replied. Large gatherings of people are impossible within the domed cities of Wolframma. Then think about what you experienced just yesterday while attending your debut, as Stardy pointed out, with thousands of people looking on in amazement as you quite literally descended from the heavens. Surely you, being telepathic, were aware of the sea of latent psychic energy that was pooling about you when you mounted the stage over yonder? Oh, Marcel faintly blushed. Yeah. I do remember what that felt like. There was so much energy. So many minds, thoughts and emotions. You found it overwhelming, as Stardy smiled. Don't be embarrassed, it is quite natural for you to find yourself at the center of a spotlight, given that you are the closest thing to a heavenly being that the people here have ever witnessed. Now, imagine the jealousy and resentment that Chiller felt towards you, seeing you receive so much adulation that he thought should have been his to claim. But I never meant to. Marcel started to protest. It does not matter to him whether or not your intentions were pure, as Stardy warned her. Men like Schiller cast judgment long before they hear all of the facts. The truth is that you were stealing his thunder, and he naturally sought to denounce and belittle you by calling you the one thing that plays upon the popular prejudice of this society, the image of the whore and temptress. Marcel was surprised to find herself bristling at the memory, and she managed to say between grit teeth, "He had no right to call me names like that." "No indeed," as Stardy replied, "so the question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" "Huh?" Marcel blinked. "I don't." "Let he who is without fault cast the first stone," as Stardy smiled, "and by now you are very much aware that Chiller has more than his own share of skeletons in the closet that he would rather not have be dragged into the light of day. You know him for what he is, a false prophet, deliberately misleading and taking advantage of the uninformed and easily manipulated masses. Such men are thieves who steal from the very God whom they profess to worship, and as such are criminals who should be exposed for their sins." "But won't that make me a little better than he is?" Marcel asked. "It all depends on how you approach the issue," as Stardy replied. "If you become the very thing he claims you to be, then you brand yourself as an enemy of his God. If, on the other hand, you approach him within the context of his own religion—" Marcel started to get a gleam of what the demoness was saying. "You mean, bag the lion in his own den?" "That is certainly one way of putting it," as Stardy smiled, "and you must admit that you are better suited to this task than am I. But keep in mind that your foe is not a single individual or a group but rather the very force of evil that they embody. It is a movement that would describe you as its enemy merely for existing, a mindset that treats the concept of God as though an angry father was casting judgment on a spoiled and wretched humanity. The angry God of the Old Testament who flouts the very concept of a kind and loving Jesus while exploiting his name to make a profit at the expense of the very poor and innocent to whom the historical Jesus showed great mercy. Think of the phenomenon of a group mind that envisions their God as possessing the wrath and temper of a Moses-like prophet, stripped bare of humanity's darker vices of lust, sensuality and greed. Then picture those vices pooling into a dark shadow that haunts the Church's image of the divine, a shadow that takes the form of the angry godhood and is labeled as Satan. Then you will know that the enemy to the fundamentalist is Christ himself in negative aspect." "You mean, they create their own devil to justify their own excesses?" Marcel asked. "I mean that the devil is central to their whole reason for existence," as Stardy replied, "and without him to frighten and cow the masses they lose all justification for their redemption myth. And yet the truth that they avoid seeing is that the devil has no power that they do not give to him. A man may be tempted to perform evil, but a man may resist temptation. Such is not the thinking of those to whom temptation is everything and self-indulgence is easily rationalized under the heading, 'The devil made me do it.' And Schiller is that devil?" Marcel reasoned. "He is his own worst vice and enemy," as Stardy explained, "a parasite who thrives on justifying his own excess. Understand, I do not quarrel with Christians and their ideology. To me the teachings of Ben Yusuf are very elegant and inspirational, and I do not like to see such words being twisted in the mouth of one who seeks only to pervert this message. The sayings of Jesus have been a comfort for many in this world who suffer unjust persecution." Surely there is no finer message to be found in literature than the admonition that we must not hate our enemies, that we should not do evil in return for evil, and that vengeance is best reserved for the divine order that governs fate. When Jesus admonished his followers to make their deeds a testimony to their faith, to give to charity and perform acts of mercy that would shine like a beacon to all the nations, he did not envision a world of pogroms and inquisitions with heresy trials and enclaves deciding the true intent of his words while crushing dissent and all freedom of opinion. Give a theologian political office and he will act in accordance to what he believes God would do if he had all of the facts. That is why men like Schiller must be resisted and opposed, but not through violent means that would only serve to sustain their self-gratifying sense of persecution. I think I see what you mean, Marceau slowly nodded, but what of the many contradictions in the beliefs of ordinary Christians? Leave them to their own vision of the divine, as Stardy counseled. If men and women choose to follow a pope, priest, imam or shaman they are well within their rights. It is only when they attempt to impose their beliefs upon others that they cross the line that should never be crossed, and as such set themselves up as a target for easy rebuke. Always remember, turning the other cheek is a sign of strength of character, but one only has two cheeks to spare, and then there is payback. For the first time in many hours Marceau smiled. I think I know exactly what you mean. And thank you. The elegant demoness waved a hand in dismissal. Think nothing of it, simply the words of one pilgrim who has travelled a bit further down the same road from yourself. I should never pretend to be a pillar of wisdom and virtue, my friend, but I am and shall always be your friend if you were ever again in need of such spiritual counsel. I'll try and keep that in mind. Marceau nodded. You've helped me a lot to clear up some doubts that I was having. That was always my intention, Astardi replied, turning to look off into the distance once again. Just think of it this way. Right now the man who tormented you is preparing himself for a day of prayer and alms. This being Sunday, his worshippers are gathering to hear the sermon that he intends to deliver on how he drove you away and exposed you to the masses. I should much like to see what happens when he prepares to deliver that televised sermon. Then you'd better tune in and watch, Marceau replied, because I promise you that you won't be disappointed. With that Marceau took to the skies again, levitating up into the air, feeling uplifted and warmed by the sun as it greeted her with a bright and promising new morning. Astardi watched her go before placing her sunglasses back over her opaque eyes, and then she turned and walked back over to the limousine even as the window rolled down to permit the current occupant to address her directly. Very well done, Astardi. You handled that quite well. Thank you, Magnus, Astardi replied. I knew that she would find her way soon enough. All I had to do was nudge her a little and the rest was in the hands of her friends and loved ones. And a very impressive display of tact that was, Magnus noted. I should very much enjoy listening to the Reverend Schiller's program this morning. I dare say that it will be a most memorable occasion. Like you say, Big Daddy, Felipe sniffed in amusement. I intend to record the whole thing in digital. Could be worth a lot as a bootleg copy. Then put me in for an early order. Magnus gave another rare smile before adding, Midsummers has the ball this time, and I only wonder how certain others will receive this particular divine revelation. For comments and criticisms contact me at shadowmain@ritgenet.net. Marceau the Ultra Girl by Jim Robert Bader Book 1 Part 2 The Girl of Tungsten Steel Chapter 27 Retribution. Henry Wallace Schiller stared at himself in the mirror as he prepared to go out and deliver himself before his loyal flock, confident in the knowledge that he had a very good show planned out ahead of him, one that was certain to take in a hefty sum in donations and get a good ratings share for his cable program, Hour of Evangelism, on the 600 Club network. People loved to flock to his sermons when he bearded the agents of Satan and their works, and this time should be no exception in his not too humble estimation. The message had to be sent both far and wide that flouting the word of God would bring the wrath of heaven down upon the heads of the sinners. Those who championed Satan's banner of secularism had to be pulled down from their ivory towers and shown for the wretched unbelievers that they were, and only then could the way be paved for the coming kingdom of God and Christ's return in full glory. He smiled as he saw his trusted deacon, Geoffrey Taylor, standing attentively at his side, already draped in the cloth of gold that marked his stage persona as God sent the evangelist, waiting for his mentor's word that they were to begin the message of deliverance to the faithful on this perfect Sunday morning. The younger man often looked uncomfortable before going out before the cameras, dressed in a costume that even he regarded as archaic, But Schiller had long ago convinced his ward that the outfit symbolized the banner of the Lord's gift, the silver tongue of the born evangelist that Geoffrey wielded with mesmerizing effect every time he stood before the podium pronouncing anathema and doom upon the godless who dared refuse the message of Jesus. Even Schiller found the young man's voice hypnotic when he unleashed it upon a crowd, and the presence of his charisma was such that the minions would loyally march into hell behind him if he so ordered them to battle. Of course their organization had long ago divided the wheat from the chaff of their normal congregation, and they did indeed command a loyal army that trained out in the hills of Oregon and Montana for the day when they would be rallied to exterminate the poison filth of society that contaminated what passed for culture in this much-benighted country. Geoffrey had been brilliant in organizing these cadres into a ready-on-call citizen militia without alerting the Jew-run forces of the ACLU and the ATF, those evil minions of the Antichrist currently residing in the White House, who in the past had been so quick to snuff out the burning torch of liberty when it was raised against the powers of darkness. Soon, Geoffrey, Schiller murmured as he put the last-minute touches to his appearance, straightening out his tie and nodding in satisfaction at the image which he created, soon we will begin the long march to the Promised Land, the battle that may take years to eventually win, but which surely ends at Armageddon. Yes sir, Geoffrey respectfully replied. All is happening as you predicted it would, and all is moving in readiness for the day of judgment, as it is written. Schiller turned to his right-hand minion and said, "It is as God wills it, my son, I am but his servant doing the Lord's will. It is his commandment that we fulfill this day when we expose the whore of Babylon to ridicule and bring down the faithless. It is inspiring to know that you put to flight the harlot before she could begin her reign of deception," Geoffrey noted. "I would have enjoyed it had I been there to confront the beast directly." Schiller clapped the younger man on the shoulder and smiled. "No doubt you would have exposed her fraudulence to the masses, for her powers would been as nothing to your faith. It would be as it was for the foul sorcerer, Simon Magus, when he challenged the faithful and was exposed for his demonic ways. But surely your time will come soon enough to show the godless what a true son of the church can do, but for now time to go out there and inspire the masses." With their purpose clearly stated, the two men turned and left the alcove heading for the nave of the church even as the music was cued to alert their staff that the show was about to begin and that everyone in position should be ready for their part in the overall performance. It was the kind of stage-managed event that only money could buy. Money tempered with influence and proper organization skills to ensure that a good show would be presented to the masses. A humbler church might have shunned the ostentatiousness of such a display of opulence and showmanship, but the Assembly of the Divine Order was no mere church, being larger than a cathedral and designed to be a giant stage for an international broadcast media conglomerate of stellar proportions. It was so big that the Chartres Cathedral of Notre Dame itself would have easily fit inside its dome-like ceiling with room enough to fit the bleachers and the choir on the sidelines. It was intended to give a massive impression of the vaulting roofs of heaven itself and had cost millions of dollars raised from pledges by the devoted, but the effect it created was well worth it. People who attended these sermons could expect a show worthy of a major rock concert, and all in the name of God and His infinite glory. For that effect to be achieved, however, no expense could be spared, no detail could be left to chance or overlooked, and the needs of the faithful had to be catered to with a performance that would uplift them and inspire them to donate their weekly tithes to Jesus and His modern-day disciples. The choir had to be drilled on a daily basis. The singers had to polish their gospel hymnals and the band had to be coached to play family-friendly tunes that would add to the atmosphere of revelry. No spontaneity or artistic creativity could be tolerated unless it was carefully grilled under the lens of the overall message, and every ounce of human flaw had to be squeezed on the winepress of directorship so that the sins of the faithful would not eclipse their virtues. Good planning and a ruthless coordination of the various parts that contributed to the overall whole was needed by Schiller to give the right sort of spiritual fix to the needy supplicants who came to worship in his temple. Everything was choreographed to the last chanted Hosanna, and even the audience had been carefully drilled to know where their applause lines were, at what point they were to join in and chant the lines of deliverance, and just how much enthusiasm was expected to bring a thunderous clamor that the acoustics of the building could convey to the microphones and sound managers operating in the control box far above them. Even the line of sick and crippled waiting to be healed were formed into a line so that they could one by one be called to the stage for baptism and deliverance. In short, the entire affair was keyed with the cameras in mind so that millions of television, cable and satellite viewers could witness a Schiller and Godsend deliver the revivalist message of Jesus into the comfort of their living rooms. They even had printed schedules to inform the attendees of just when each sermon, song or hymnal would be delivered, with time and dates ruthlessly adhered to. That there was no true heart to this church never even occurred to a man like Schiller, who saw tolerance for diversity as a vice, not a virtue. That the love being espoused here was dry and airy, devoid of true spiritualism, was simply beyond his limited powers of comprehension. Nor did he see any contradiction between the message of Jesus as a God of love and forgiveness when contrasted against the opposite polar image of a God who hated sin and despised all who deviated from the essentially conformist message that Schiller delivered. It was fairly routine for him to denounce Jews, Catholics, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindu, pagans and Rotarians as the minions of Satan. Even Mormons, Presbyterians, Methodists and Quakers were viewed here as spawn of the unholy, and all who took the side of abortionists, evolutionists, homosexuals, liberals, humanists and other minorities were marked as targets for God's righteous wrath. No one escaped the lash of scorn and derision when Schiller stood at the podium to decry all things that were not in keeping with his interpretation of the Bible. His verbal shotgun was ready and cocked to target the enemies of Jesus, and if you were a follower of any other faith but his, then you were guilty of heresy and witchcraft, fit only for the fires of perdition. Looking upon the hundreds of bright and cheerful faces in attendance for today, Schiller was thrilled at his own success, marveling how he could have come from such humble beginnings to the lofty heights that he now strode these days, at the top of his performance among the rights of televangelist preachers. Unlike a few of his chosen profession, Schiller did not shun the label, viewing it as a mark of distinction that he had arrived as a media powerhouse who could make and break politicians. So what if those mealy-mouthed doubting Thomases of the Council of Churches took exception with his financial management practices and the stridency of his message? Schiller was unapologetic for being the robust stallion of God that he was, and would continue to preach and spend as he saw fit until God himself told him otherwise. And all this having grown up from a small parish in the hinterlands of Georgia, when he had been forced to begin his sermons by preaching inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta, delivering his message and honing his abilities as a preacher on the sticky floor that once housed cartons of soda pop, hence his early nickname as Soda Pop Schiller. He smiled as he thought of his critics back then, those who had never dreamed that he would fare this well or go as far in his sacred calling, and as he thought of his critics his smile turned into a nasty sneer that he briefly displayed before smothering it once again beneath the unctuous benevolent smile that he ordinarily wore before the public. He glanced briefly up at the control booth and gave a faintly perceptible nod to the stage director, cueing that his performance was about to begin. The crew in the booth worked feverishly to meet the 8 o'clock morning deadline that the cable broadcasters had slated as the show's beginning. This would be a very important event in the history of Schiller's mission, and nothing could be allowed to go wrong. Cold-eyed men wearing ties and shirts operated the controls to key the automated fountains to begin spraying, the lighting to dim around the podium while the spotlights converged on where Schiller was shortly to be standing. Market analysis and test researching had determined the right amount of color that could be used to create the perfect halo-like effect when cast against the suit that Schiller was wearing, and even the teleprompters displaying Schiller's sermon were brought online for the big performance. The choir began chanting their opening hymnal while the announcer gave the sponsor's line and credited the identity of the station, and then Schiller advanced towards the center stage, a general fully in command of his army and preparing to order his troops into spiritual battle against Lucifer and his harlot. Schiller basked happily in the glow of applause that his congregation paid to him as the light came on to signify such salutation. Geoffrey assumed his place near the rear to the stage, not wanting to eclipse his mentor, knowing full well that his cue would not come for another 15 minutes, so he settled back and prepared to be bedazzled. Schiller checked to see that his microphone was in place and that the test light signified that he was being received without either distortion or static, and so he made a soft noise to clear his mouth and began to speak his opening oratory. "Dear friends," he began, "welcome once again to the house of the Lord. Today I must speak about a dangerous menace to our society." And that was when everything began going wrong, as someone else drowned him out in both force and volume. "Repent, sinner, for the hour of judgment is upon you." For a moment Schiller was stunned into speechlessness, hearing the projected feminine tones ringing out from seeming everywhere at once, even more loudly inside his head as he sought the source of this untimely interruption. He briefly glanced at his security chief and encountered only vague incomprehension, and only then did he become aware of another presence inside the hall other than his chosen faithful. She made her presence known in a rather spectacular way, appearing in the air above their heads as though manifesting there and giving off a potent aura of golden radiance that drew all eyes to her direction. She descended in a cloak of glory, floating in the air with cape billowing out behind her and setting off the gleam of her metallic skin and hair. She drifted to the far end of the indoor pool that Schiller used for communal baptism, and then when her feet touched the shimmering pool she halted, refusing to sink below but rather began walking over the surface of the water. "Who let you inside this house of God, woman?" Schiller immediately demanded. "Begone at once, Lucifer. You have no dominion over me," Marceau declared, "nor do I recognize the authority of a fraud and a huckster. You are no more a man of the very faith you profess than I am a demon, and I can prove that before the very God you defame that you are a coward and a liar unworthy of the name of priest." "Blasphemy!" Schiller cried, waving a hand at his security people. "Remove her from my sight." There was a slight hesitation in the expression of the security chief, but he knew his job depended on his swift compliance and thus ordered his men forward, only to be met by a wave of force that slammed into them and sent them tumbling backwards. "This is supposed to be a house of worship and devotion," Marceau said as she stretched out a hand and caused an object hidden beneath the jacket of the security chief to come loose from its holster. The gun flew into her hand and she snatched it out of the air before presenting it before the congregation, making the magazine and chambered round fall free, then loudly pronouncing, "Weapons have no place on holy soil. Let those who take up the sword in arms be mindful that they blaspheme against the Prince of Peace whom they pretend to worship." As she said this, the gun began glowing brightly in her hand, turning red-hot in her gloved fingers before melting into a pool of metal that hissed when it struck the water. As this happened, the various security people started crying out in pain and dismay, yanking their own guns out of their jackets and throwing them away, disarming themselves with great alacrity without noticing that their weapons were not similarly glowing red-hot, the effect created in their minds being more the product of telepathic suggestion. Marceau turned back to Schiller and said, "Let he who is without fault cast the first stone, Reverend. You started this by challenging me with your vile accusations. Are you ready to hear my rebuttal, you foul beast of a man, you base pretender?" "Silence!" Schiller cried, "you have no right." "I have every right to come here and denounce you," Marceau replied as she levitated herself back into the air, putting herself deliberately in line with the best camera angle so that her confrontation with Schiller would be broadcast live to those millions of viewers whose minds he routinely poisoned. "I sought no confrontation with you, nor did I challenge your faith either deliberately or unintentionally, but you chose to single me out as your Judas goat for public ridicule. You defamed the name of a good woman who has shown me only kindness and brought shame upon your order. You have sown the wind. Now you must reap the whirlwind." With that she raised her hand and caused a wave of force to radiate outward, her telekinesis causing the very air itself to shiver and vibrate as she directed her energy at the artificial lighting along the sides of the cathedral-like dome. They exploded internally as the forces within them were collapsed in one instant, creating a very loud noise whose intensity was greatly amplified all around, though the actual structural damage to the building itself was minimal. However, some panels pushed outward created holes in the ceiling through which natural sunlight began to filter, giving the right effect that she wanted to create here as she turned this revivalist meeting against its own promoter. "This house is supposed to belong to your God, Reverend," Marceau declared as she floated above the now silent chamber, "but you have turned it into a house of iniquity, a house of mammon where moneylenders not only have run of the place but staff it. Insolent harridan!" Schiller managed to croak out past the tightness in his own throat, "I'll have you arrested for this." "Go ahead and try to sue me," Marceau replied, "I'll meet you in a higher court any day that you like, but you will no longer be able to shelter yourself with the millions that you have fleeced from these misguided people. I know all about your spending habits and financial doings, Reverend Schiller. I know about the tax shelters and private numbered accounts that you have salted away for your own petty enrichment. I know about the terrorist camps where you train fanatics to kill doctors and bomb abortion clinics. I know all about that mistress you keep, the one with the expensive taste in jewelry that your wife tolerates out of blind devotion and a pension salary from you, her husband." She stressed the word, watching Schiller flinch in shock and dismay, the guilt in his expression as manifest as the disbelief that she could have discovered his dark and perverted secrets. "How could you? There is no way you could know!" he all but screamed. "Poor and pathetic wretch of a man, Have you idea what you are dealing with here? She taunted softly. Do you honestly believe that you are more divinely gifted than me? That your God listens to the prayers of a man who defames them with every other breath while ignoring one who walks in the path of the light and makes her home among the heavens? Just which of us do you imagine to be the sinner here, and which of us the servant of the divine within us? She saw confusion turn to horror as he stared up at the radiant vision that she presented, a fearful man confronted with something beyond his understanding, and Marcel was almost moved to feel pity for the fool, but knew full well that he was little more than a child masquerading as an adult and lacked the proper supervision of a conscience. A man such as this could rationalize anything, and if left to his own devices he would continue to exploit the masses. Unseen by Marcel but hovering at the side of the stage, Geoffrey Taylor stood immobilized, held rooted to the spot by a power unlike any that he had ever felt before, torn between loyalty to his mentor and a sense that he, too, was out of his depths. The Golden Woman was an unearthly beauty to torment the mind and torture the devoted, tempting one to bask in the glow that she radiated, and yet leaving him feeling very much like the moth to her flame. He felt the power contained within her vessel and trembled in wonder at it all, power such as he had never known before, and yet oddly thirsted for as he continued to look on, a helpless, hopeless witness. Poor sinner, Marcel allowed herself to drift down towards the central stage, remaining only a few meters beyond Schiller's reach as she confronted him, letting the imposing measure of her size add to the effect created as she looked the terrified man in the eyes and to his full measure. Did you truly believe that you could hide from me the dark recesses of your heart? The true reason why you taunted me and said those awful things about both me and Heather Holberg? Shame on you, considering that Heather spends millions on charity while you spend less than 5% of the riches you type upon the poor and the needy. And those so-called religious schools of forced indoctrination that you sponsor? Shame on you. You spreader of hate and disseminator of vile nonsense. You cannot threaten me in my own house, Schiller protested while cowering away. Your house? Marcel said, I thought this was a house devoted to your lord, or has the ownership passed into your personal possession? It's mine, Schiller declared. I am the Lord's chosen servant. Oh really? Marcel asked, did he choose you or did you choose to associate with him? It's easy to idolize with a power greater than yourself, but you bring no credit and only shame to the teachings of Jesus. Did he not tell you to respect the law and leave questions of justice up to heaven? Who gave you the authority to act as judge and jury for your fellow human being, or to demonize people of a different faith, or to preach indifference towards those who cannot defend themselves against tyranny? And yet you have done all of this and more while professing to be a servant of Jesus. Up in the control booth the director was going wild, seeing his employer being humiliated on the airwaves, and so he frantically called out, go to commercial. Cut the feed. For God's sake, cut to a commercial. We can't. One of the technicians reported while desperately working his keyboard, we're locked out of the system. We can't control the feed or the transmission. Someone's hacked into our system. Another controller reported, our passwords aren't being accepted, and the main relays are offline. The transmissions are going out directly. All at once a spark flared up and shorted out their keyboards, and the monitors at their stations were next to go haywire, the image briefly being replaced by the synthesized aspect of a woman who wagged a finger in their direction and said, and oh you don't boys, this transmission is going out live and without commercial interruption. You dare profane the Lord's name with your harlot's lips? Schiller declared with a hopeless quaver in his voice. You are a very sick man, Schiller, Marcel declared sadly. I can see into your mind and it is twisted, full of perverse images and delusional rantings. I can see a pattern of abuse and neglect that you experienced in your childhood, leading you to hate homosexuals as you identify them with a crime committed against you by a kinsman. Yet you joined the ranks of the clergy to escape the draft years ago but have spent your entire career urging others to go to war against everything that you label as evil. Yet why do you pick targets who are weaker than yourself and your organization, with all the riches that you harvest from pensioners and widows? Schiller forced himself to look away from his accuser, belatedly becoming aware that he had an audience for his denouncement, so he frantically waved a hand and cried, do not listen to her lies, my people. Her falsehoods are meant to mislead you to the very gates of hell. You speak to me of falsehood, you purveyor of lies and bearer of false witness? Marcel asked, what about that girl you abused in your office? Or that woman you raped in that hotel down in Florida? I can see it all in your thoughts, even the evil, disgusting little thing that you have ever done while claiming the authority of heaven. But who are you to say if I am a servant of heaven or hell, you who can rationalize anything while preaching violence to your extremist colleagues? I think that I will leave you to the judgment of your peers and the legal authorities from now on. I have said my piece, but I can no longer stomach probing through your psychotic ramblings looking for the fragments of the truth that you bury. Make your peace with your God, if you truly believe in Him at all. I pity you, sir. If anyone is in need of forgiveness it is you, and that is not in my jurisdiction." She turned her back to Schiller and addressed herself at his congregation, "And you people, what are you doing here in this place listening to the rantings of this hate-filled fool? Are your lives so empty and barren of meaning that you cling to his robes and shun the company of your fellow human being? How many of you walk over a poor person without thinking, or speak condescendingly to a neighbor? How many of you waste the riches of the earth to sate your own self-indulgence? When was the last time that you committed a kind act towards a stranger? Or have you ever spoken to a family member and told them that you appreciate them with all their imperfections? How can you fail to do any of this and still call yourselves followers of Jesus?" The audience milled about, confused and uncertain of what to do. They were used to being led about by the nose by carefully scripted lines and choreographed stock phrases, so this wholly unscripted speech left them blinking their eyes and showing faint traces of actual human emotion. The glassy-eyed, trance-like state of the fervent believer was replaced by faint traces of doubt and uncertainty that bordered on critical self-examination, and some found this a very frightening concept, while others had a flicker of hope and inspiration replace the gloom of their own lives, and a few more actually started to listen. Think well of what you do when you give yourself over to a false prophet, letting him decide for you what course your lives are to take and what meaning there is to be found in your existence. Marceau continued, "Remember that it is your deeds and not just your words that can determine if you are a good or a bad person, and that people who live in glass houses should not cast stones at another." With that she thrust her hand upward again and once more released her power in a wave of force that was directly skyward. She projected a psychokinetic blast at the ceiling tiles, blowing them outward while leaving the structural frames intact, and instantly gave the place a new sunroof, being careful to send the shards flying off in different directions so they would not fall upon the people. Her violent action caused many to cry out and throw up their hands in terror, but when only sunlight descended upon their heads they started to look up and see the blue heavens and the light that felt warm and different from the artificiality of the temple dome itself. This caused more than a few to cast new looks towards Marceau, and more than a bit of awe found its way to their expressions. "A church should be a place of life, not a place where you wait to die of boredom," Marceau said. "Be good to each other and be kind to yourselves. Pause and reflect before you judge people, and remember, you are all the sons and daughters of one Spirit, children of the earth and sun that give you life. Don't concern yourself with the imperfections of others, live happy lives and appreciate the gifts that you have already been given. Above all else, to your own selves be true." And with that she rose into the air, hovering slowly over the crowd as she let the sunbeams shine against her, at which point she began glowing once again as her aura intensified, giving her entire glistening body a radiant halo. And then she was gone, rising up into the sky, leaving only a cowering Schiller and a bedazzled crowd to stare up at her passing. Geoffrey blinked his eyes, the spell finally broken, and he turned to see his mentor huddled on the ground, weeping like a small child while security people and church staff milled about like actors on a stage who had no lines and no direction. Finally the director in the booth far above broke his own silence over the matter, closing his mouth and coughing a little before saying, "Now that was a performance. I wonder if she already has an agent?" Her friends greeted her back at the Playmate office in downtown San Francisco, and there was a carnival-like atmosphere already underway with the women on Heather's staff toasting champagne and breaking out the cheese and crackers. Naturally enough it was Phoebe who summarized the general consensus here as she greeted Marceau with an enthusiastic hug and a cry of, "You did it, Marcia! You goddamned beautiful pagan angel!" "Thank you," Marceau replied as she embraced Phoebe in return. "I'm feeling much better now, in spite of the unpleasantness that I discovered in the mind of Schiller." "You really cut him down to size," Katie commented with a smile. "You made him look like a hypocritical fool in front of his own people." "A brilliantly played strategy and a treat well worth the wait," Heather agreed, I would have paid good money to have televised that event myself. Heck with that, Kathy says, I'd have paid big bucks to see it live. And that walking on the water thing? That was a nice touch. Of course, by blowing a hole in his ceiling you did leave yourself open to a lawsuit, Fiona duly noted, playing the devil's advocate. Let him sue. Heather folded her arms and smiled confidently. I've already prepared a counter-suit for slandering my client and causing financial loss by his antics of yesterday. Considering that I am also about to release a devastating series of exposés highlighting the many crimes that can be alleged against Schiller, and I am simultaneously making available my evidence to the police, including a number of sworn depositions that have been signed by some of his victims, I rather imagine that he will be much too busy to deal with us. If anything, he may well settle out of court in our favor, at which point I will request a formal public apology for slandering Marsaw. If you had that much evidence against him, why were you withholding it? Katie asked. Hey, we weren't withholding anything, Kathy explained. The police have known about a lot of stuff regarding Schiller for some time now, but they didn't have enough to make a case, let alone ward off the political and public flack that they would have taken. But Marsaw's rather public display will give them the impetus that they have long needed. Heather's smile became more predatory. Schiller has often boasted that he has the means to buy politicians. Let us see if he can buy his way out of a jail term. After all, statutory rape laws are very strictly enforced in the state of California. Then good riddance to him. Phoebe smiled up at Marsaw. Let's hope we heard the last of that creep and his legion of fundies. Yes, Marsaw agreed. Let us hope that it is so. And yet, I fear that there are some who will find fault in my actions. It was necessary what I did, but I take no enjoyment in having to publicly expose such a man to the light of ridicule. Truly he has a very disturbed mind, and I fear that some of his people will be provoked to seek retribution for his undoing. Let 'em come, Katie snorted. If they come looking for us, then they're gonna get more than they can handle. Hope you're right about that, Kathy says. Schiller was a clown, but I hear that Taylor guy, the one who calls himself Godsend, he's a real piece of work, I tell you. There are plenty of people like him in the world, Fiona noted. When they can't win with words they resort to using bullets. Takes more than a bullet to stop an ultra girl, Phoebe boasted, adding in a more sullen note, especially with all the special training we've been getting lately. Oh yes, Heather remarked. How is that going, by the way? I'm making some real progress with these two, Katie replied, but they still have a lot of work to do before I'm even halfway satisfied. In fact, I think it's time to ratchet things up to a new level for the both of you. Her two primary students received this information with matching, if dubious, expressions, Marsaw wincing slightly about the cheeks while Phoebe looked a bit green and most distinctively swallowed. In the meantime, Heather smiled. I doubt that even your sensei will object to your having a little fun on the side for a day or so, especially seeing as how you have more than earned it. I think I can go along with that. For now, Katie smiled, I feel like doing a little celebrating myself after seeing Schiller get what was coming to him. All right then, if we get a little all-girl orgy going on the sly? Kathy grinned. Possibly later, Heather answered with a smile, after we make an official announcement and reschedule another debut to make up for the last one. Oh, and contact the governor and the mayor to inform them that this time there will be no unplanned interruptions. Got it, Chief, Fiona smiled, turning and winking at Kathy, and dibs on the orgy if Big Gold Ear gets to attend it. You got it, Kathy winked, reaching out a hand to hug Heather. Phoebe turned to Marsaw and telepathically asked, why do I get the impression that we're about to be invited to take part in that party? Just be nice and we'll politely decline the offer, Phoebe-chan, Marsaw responded. What's the matter, kids? Katie mused as she joined in on their rapport, afraid of a little group action? Katie. Phoebe reacted, are you suggesting we should take part in this? Don't have a snit, Katie replied, consider it a new part of your training, and with the advanced techniques that I've been teaching the both of you, you ought to excel at this sort of action. Marsaw reluctantly said, an orgy consists of many people having sex together, right? That's the basic idea, Katie mentally responded. Then that means that we and Heather and the others. Marsaw mentally flashed a picture of the 20-plus other women currently attending the revelry in progress and considered what it might be like to make love to every one of them, and was surprised to find that the idea was actually quite intriguing. Marcia. Phoebe snapped, immediately sensing the line of thought and where it was leading. I was just curious." Marcel winced slightly, linking hands with Phoebe before saying aloud, "But you're the only one I really want to spend time with." "HMPH, you'd better mean that," Phoebe replied with ruffled humor. "We got another show to put on in a couple of weeks, and once Katie here gets us back into training." "Right," Marcel replied, giving Katie a nod, like Sensei said. "It's all about training. Life itself is training, students." Katie gave them a wink. "But you should learn never to let an opportunity get away from you, and if Heather's throwing a party you can bet that I'll be there, orgy or no orgy." "I think she's serious," Marcel mentally commented. "I think you're right," Phoebe mentally replied before the two exchanged smiles and said aloud, "It's all about training." The concrete block was 4 by 6 by 2 feet of unreinforced masonry, 3 tons held suspended above 2 steel girders that supported it over the stage, and Marcel shattered it neatly in half with a single shudo chop, much to her sensei's qualified approval. Not content with merely shattering the objects, Marcel then reached down and hefted the two halves in either arm, then began to juggle them over the stage as though the unevenly balanced objects were made of styrofoam instead of the hardened mixture of lime and granite that they were, which earned from her mentor the sly comment of, "Show off." The audience applauded the display even as Heather cheered them on with an encouraging, "How about that, ladies and gentlemen?" Another world-shattering record display of physical might by the Ultra Girl, our good friend from another world, Marcel. Marcel finished off her demonstration of raw prowess by hefting the blocks into the air, then one by one reduced them into smaller chunks with rapid punches of both hands. She made certain to extend her telekinetic field so that no stray bits of concrete flew into the audience, and then she gathered the chunks into her mental net and telekinetically dropped them into a waiting barrel. "And there you have another demonstration of why recycling is good for the environment," Heather pleasantly continued, "and just to show that this applies to metal as well as silicon." Marcel took her cue and picked up one of the steel girders, holding it out for public inspection before bending it double. She did the same with the other girder, then deposited them off to the side after fusing the ends together to create a single square-shaped object. Next up she was presented with a new luxury sports car, and Marcel had to pick this up with great delicacy, her telekinesis flowing from her hands to make the body and frame as light as a feather, and careful not to accidentally dent the undercarriage with her fingers. She placed it at the other end of the stage, at which point Phoebe climbed behind the wheel and drove it away to a parking space reserved at the rear of the platform. Marcel next demonstrated her levitation ability by flying around the stage and soaring out over the audience before returning to the side of Heather. Immediately following this she used her pyrokinesis to set fire to a number of prepared paper targets, all the while making it seem both effortless and second nature. Few among the audience would appreciate how long and hard Marcel had trained to hone her abilities to this level, but only Phoebe and Katie knew for sure the degree of practice that it had taken to ensure that nothing untoward would occur on this second scheduled demonstration. Rick Shepard, who had been honored by a personal invitation from Heather to attend in the front row of the press gathering, sat enraptured as he watched his golden angel perform the sort of astonishing feats that he had only dreamed about in his childhood. At one point he would have sworn that Marcel even looked directly at him and gave a wink, but for the most part she tended to spread her attention to the rest of the audience so as to leave many with the impression that she was flirting in their direction. "Harry's gonna love this one," he heard someone say before a bag of peanuts was offered to him. "Have some, they're unsalted." "Huh?" Rick almost jumped out of his seat when he recognized who it was that had just made the offer. "You? Why does everybody always say that?" The other man shrugged. "Of course it's me, Shepard. Who did you think it was, the Pope?" "What are you doing here, Major?" Rick asked as he formed himself to be calm, cool and collected, all the while feeling the urge to put distance between himself and the Black Ops specialist, who presently was dressed up as a civilian. "Hey, I'm here with the family on my day off," Brookhurst replied. "My kid wants an autograph the worst way, and you know how it is. She sure is something to watch, huh?" "Oh yeah," Rick forced himself to return his focus to the activities on the stage. "So, what do you think your chances are?" Brookhurst asked. "Think the big lady's gonna succumb to that manly charm of yours? There's a betting pool going on among my boys just in case you're interested." "What do you want here?" Rick could not hide his frustration. "You're not gonna try and arrest her with all these people watching?" Now why would I want to do that? Brookhurst asked as though the question were unthinkable. It's still a free country, and she's not breaking any laws that I can see. Besides, I'm not a cop. Let somebody else try slapping her in handcuffs. My job's strictly surveillance. You mean you're spying on her? Rick asked. I mean we know where she lives, Brookhurst shrugged. Wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't know that. So far, though, the folks I answer to back in Washington have decided to keep their hands off and let things sort themselves out for the moment. Besides, I'd be lying to say we strictly disapproved of her recent activities, especially in putting to rout a certain public nuisance. You mean Schiller? Rick replied. That good old boy was a major fundraiser for the opposition party, Brookhurst noted, and we've had our eye on him for quite a while now, so the big lady just made it easier for us to move in with a subpoena. We closed down a few of those camps where he'd been training terrorists for Jesus. Haven't yet got the rest of the organization, though, but I hear that Taylor's taken over the outfit and disavowed any knowledge of his mentor's financial dealings. Yeah, right, Rick snorted. You ask me, he's a worse threat to public safety than Schiller ever could be. Won't get any argument out of me on that, Brookhurst replied, nodding to the stage again before adding, just off the record, though, I'm glad that lady seems to be on our side. For now anyway. What do you mean for now? Rick frowned. I mean that this goes way beyond Schiller or the fundies or any other group of wackos who might be coming out of the woodwork, Brookhurst said seriously. My superiors in Washington are growing concerned that the people from her world may be sending us another visitor sometime soon, somebody a lot nastier than your golden girlfriend. Another somebody from her world? Rick found the idea more than slightly alarming. You're kidding? Wish I was, Brookhurst replied, starting to get up. Well, said my piece, and you can quote me as an anonymous source and all that. Gotta get back to the family before my wife thinks I've turned gay on the sidelines. Wouldn't do much for my career, either, if people thought I was consorting with reporters. You really mean it? About Washington keeping a hands-off policy for now? Rick asked before the major had taken more than 2 steps away from his seat. I mean the big lady's got friends in some pretty high places. Brookhurst turned and winked at Rick before putting a finger to his lips and adding, but that's our little secret. Be seeing you around, Shepard. Not if I see you first, Major, Rick softly replied before turning a thoughtful look back towards Marsaw and adding, pretty high places, huh? I wonder just how high up the food chain that is? President Thomas Parker stormed into the office of the Vice President, waving a just-received memo as he thundered, would you mind telling me just what the hell this is about? Why am I always the last person to know about these things? And why the heck have the wheels of government ground to a complete halt around here? Is everybody on lunch break or something? I couldn't reach anyone else in your office. Calm down, dear, the Vice President responded, setting aside the folder that she had been reading from to look up at her husband. Most of the secretaries are either on lunch break or are gathered in the common room for a special conference meeting. You mean you didn't hear about it? No. Parker stared with his single icy blue eye at his wife and said, I'd heard that there was something going on in San Francisco, but I've been too busy dealing with the Pakistani treaty negotiations to pay all that much attention to the news. Honestly, Tom, Caroline Parker sighed, you really need to climb out of the foxhole sometime and get out into the world more often. Don't worry, though, I've set the VCR to record the broadcast. We can watch it later in the West Wing. Are you telling me that the entire White House is on a lunch break just so they can watch some special event of a woman lifting heavy objects? What if something monumental, God forbid, should happen to the rest of the country? I'm sure that you'll manage just as you always do, Tom, Caroline replied, picking up her remote and powering on her own office TV, which immediately came online on a major cable news network. Parker stared at the picture for several minutes before grudgingly admitting, all right. So maybe that is a little special. How kind of you to notice. Caroline was amused at her husband's attempt at nonchalance, leaning back in her leather chair before she added, of course it would help if you read the intelligence briefings that we receive on her almost daily, though I think the more reliable information so far has come from certain outside sources. Parker was about to ask his wife and running mate what she meant when his single eye chanced to catch sight of a brown-wrapped object laying on the desk, and to this he gestured. You mean that? He reached out to pick it up, noticing a sly smile crossing the lovely features of his blonde vice president, which he always found particularly alarming. A moment later he found out why, his eyebrows climbing to his hairline. Almost against his will he scanned the pictures before reaching the attached articles, taking note of the fact that his wife's staff obviously had been very careful to preserve the magazine paper with plastic lamination. "This is your idea of an outside source?" he asked dryly. Straight from the mouth of the alien herself, Caroline grinned. "Can you think of a better inside source? Go ahead and take that with you." "No thanks," Parker deliberately set it down as though afraid that it might bite him. "If people saw me reading that in the Oval Office there'd be talk all over Washington." "So what's a bit of controversy to us?" Caroline shrugged. "One more scandal won't amount to an impeachment." "I think one of my predecessors said that, and look what happened to him," Parker noted as he turned away and took his leave of the office, murmuring to himself as he went, "Maybe it wasn't such a great idea to get that law suspended on family members serving together. Guess we really do pay for our sins sooner or later." "Another failure?" Darkham exclaimed. "Haven't your people fixed the problem with targeting yet?" "Apologies, Your Grace," Gaston replied. "We are trying to fix the alignment between stars, but with a distance this vast, over 1,000 cycles." "I am not interested in excuses," Darkham thundered. "I need results, and soon. Our agent has nearly completed his training and will be ready to deploy just as soon as you people can work the details for this infernal transporter." "Problems, Counselor?" asked Caspar as he strode into the chamber. "Nothing that cannot be managed, Commander," Darkham all but snarled back, "though perhaps you should use your influence to persuade these techs to make better progress in their working the defects out of their machine." Said technicians looked up from their monitoring stations to turn anxious expressions in the direction of both men, Gaston visibly paling. "I see no point in needless interrogations," Caspar replied, bringing immediate relief to the dozen anxious men all around them. "Not when they are working as hard as they are able to meet the council deadlines, and anything my people might do would most likely interfere with future progress." That latter part brought back the nervousness, and at once said technicians turned back and buried themselves into their work. "You are aware that your son will be the beneficiary of the safe and reliable operation of the transporter, Commander?" Darkham glared. "If I were you I would hardly be this complacent." "Complacency has nothing to do with it, Counselor," Caspar replied, "and I would not wish you to distress yourself over the matter. You are only just recovering from your period of convalescence. That is none of your concern." Darkham snapped, only to visibly make an effort at calming himself once again. "I merely wish to stress that the future success of this mission depends on their competence." "Chief Engineer," Caspar said without turning his head. "Commander?" Gaston nervously responded. "Are your people doing everything that they can to ensure the safety of my son and the success of this mission?" Caspar inquired. "Commander, my lord," Gaston licked his lips before resuming, "I cannot change the laws of physics, not even to suit the wishes of the Council." "You will do what we tell you to do," Darkham snapped, "and if we request you to perform a miracle, then you most certainly will do it or face the consequences. If the Councillor wishes to make it a direct order, then you are at liberty," Caspar remarked. "However, as they know what they are doing, and I most certainly do not, I am forced to defer to their judgment. I recommend patience, Councillor. The world known as Earth is not going anywhere, at least not so far that we could not find it when we wished." "To within a reasonable percentage of certainty," Gaston timidly added. Darkham said something guttural and then angrily stormed out of the chamber. Caspar turned to the anxious Gaston and said, "I will speak with the High Council if you require more time. In the meanwhile, carry on with your work, Chief Engineer." "Yes, Commander," Gaston replied, visibly sweating. Caspar exited the chamber, pausing only to give a brief glance at the teleporter, feeling a wealth of conflicting emotion, seeing both the promise and the threat that the infernal machine signified and wondering if this whole project would be the salvation of their world or the bane of their existence. Either way he knew that events were in motion that would be impossible to stop, and so he turned away and headed for a certain meeting with Dev, or as other plans were in the work, plots that would greatly affect the course of history and life, as they knew it, in the domed city of Ninjarma. And Part 3 Book 1 Marsa, the Ultra Girl Heroine is Made, Not Born Part 4 to continue the series by Jim Robert Bader, October 3, 2001.